Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Daniel Ashworth, and I've been a forest ranger for 17 years. People think that's a long time to spend in the mountains, but when you love something the way I love these peaks, time doesn't matter much. I've climbed every major mountain in the Appalachians, rescued more than 200 people, and I thought I knew these hills better than anyone alive. I was wrong about that last part. Cherokee National Forest is my home. Has been since I got out of the military in 1966. I was a mountaineer in the Army, spent time in places where the air was thin and the ground fell away beneath your boots. When I came back to North Carolina, I wanted to use those skills to help people instead of fight wars. The Forest Service was happy to have someone who could climb the dangerous spots and bring folks home safe. My cabin sits about 3 miles from Grandfather Mountain's base. It's small, just me and my gear, and that's how I like it. Most rangers work with partners, but I've always done better alone. People think I'm strange for that, living by myself at 39 with no wife or kids. But the mountains don't judge you. They just are what they are. And they expect the same honesty from you. The Cherokee people who lived here before us had stories about these peaks, old stories about spirits and guardians that most folks today would call superstition. I used to think that way too. Used to think the Cherokee just didn't understand geology and weather patterns the way we do now. But spending 17 years up here teaches you things that don't fit in any textbook. December of 1983 was brutal, even by mountain standards. We had ice storms that knocked out power for weeks, and winds that could push a grown man off his feet. The kind of winter that kills people who don't respect it. I was getting ready to recommend closing the high trails when the call came in about 3 missing climbers. Professional climbers, according to the report. Not weekend warriors or college kids trying to prove something. These were people who knew what they were doing. Mark Bradley, Sarah Chen, and Tom Phillips. All of them had climbed in Alaska and the Rockies. Sarah had even done some routes in the Himalayas. If they were missing, something had gone very wrong. The storm made helicopter rescue impossible. Radio signals kept cutting in and out because of the ice buildup on the towers. It was just me, my climbing gear, and whatever was waiting for me up on those peaks. I should have known something was off when I found their base camp. Everything was set up perfectly. Their tents were arranged in a neat triangle, guy lines tight, gear organized like they were planning to be there for weeks. But there were no tracks leading away from the camp. Not even partial ones that the wind might have covered. It was like they had just vanished into thin air. Their climbing plan was pinned to a board inside the main tent. They were attempting a winter route up Grandfather's north face, following a line that I'd climbed myself a dozen times. Not easy, but nothing that should have stopped experienced mountaineers. The weather had been stable for 3 days before they disappeared. Perfect climbing conditions for December. But when I looked up at the mountain that morning, something felt different. I've been climbing for over 20 years, and you develop instincts about these things. The way the light hits the rock, the sound the wind makes through the peaks, the feeling you get in your stomach when conditions are about to change. That morning, staring up at Grandfather Mountain, my instincts were screaming at me to go home. I ignored them. 3 people were missing, and it was my job to bring them back. As I packed my rescue gear, I tried to push away the memory of what my grandfather used to tell me about these mountains. He was half Cherokee, and he'd grown up hearing the old stories from his grandmother. Stories about Kitawa, the ancient spirit that ruled the highest peaks. According to the stories, Kitawa had been here since the world was young, and he didn't like it when people tried to climb his domain without showing proper respect. The mountain has a heartbeat, my grandfather used to say. Most folks can't hear it, but it's always there, slow and deep like the earth itself breathing. But sometimes, when people anger the old spirits, that heartbeat changes, gets faster, angrier. And when that happens, Daniel, you stay away from the high places. I'd always thought those were just stories. Beautiful stories that connected people to the land, but stories nonetheless. That morning, strapping on my climbing harness and checking my gear one last time, I found myself listening for that heartbeat. And God help me, I thought I could hear it. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Anyone who's spent time in the mountains knows they're never really quiet. There's always something: wind through the trees, birds calling, the distant sound of water running over rocks. But that morning, climbing toward where the three mountaineers had disappeared, the world felt muffled and strange. I followed their route up the lower slopes, looking for any sign of what might have happened. The snow was deep but not dangerous, and their tracks were clear enough to follow. For the first 2 hours, everything looked normal. They'd been moving at a good pace, taking rest stops in logical places, following the safest line up the mountain. Then I found the first rope. It was hanging from a cliff face, about 60 feet above the tree line, attached to a piton that had been driven deep into solid granite. Nothing wrong with that, except the rope ended in midair. No climber attached, no sign of where they might have gone. Just 30 feet of good climbing rope swaying in the wind like a broken spider web. I rappelled down to examine it more closely. The end of the rope hadn't been cut. It looked like it had been torn. The fibers were shredded in a way I'd never seen before, like something with enormous strength had grabbed the rope and simply ripped it apart. But there were no tool marks, no knife cuts. Just destruction. That's when I heard the first sound that didn't belong. It was low and deep, almost below the range of human hearing. Like the mountain itself was groaning. I'd heard rockfalls before, and avalanches, and the sound that ice makes when it shifts and cracks. This wasn't any of those things. This sounded like something alive. I tried to radio back to base, but the radio was full of static. I could make out a few words from dispatch, but they couldn't hear me at all. The storm had cleared, but something was still interfering with the signal. Following the route higher, I found more gear scattered on impossible ledges. A helmet wedged into a crack 40 feet off the climbing route. An ice axe buried point first in a boulder, driven so deep that I couldn't pull it free. Most disturbing were the pitons, metal spikes that climbers hammer into rock cracks for protection. I found a dozen of them pulled completely out of the rock, bent into twisted shapes like someone had grabbed them with bare hands and crumpled them like paper. But it was the footprints that made my blood go cold. I found them in a patch of snow on a narrow ledge, clear as photographs. Size 14 boots, maybe larger. Deep impressions that showed whoever made them was carrying serious weight. But these prints were 50 feet away from the climbing route, on a ledge that would have required expert technical climbing to reach. And they weren't human footprints. Oh, the basic shape was right, 2 feet, 10 toes, but they were too big, too wide, and the toe impressions showed something that looked more like claws than nails. Each print was 18 inches long and surrounded by what looked like scrape marks, as if whatever made them had fingers that dragged against the rock as it moved. I'd been a ranger for 17 years. I'd seen bear tracks, mountain lion tracks, tracks from every animal that lived in these mountains. These were something else entirely. The trail of prints led higher, toward the technical climbing section, where the mountaineers would have needed ropes and protection to make any progress. I followed them, even though every instinct I had was telling me to turn around and get off the mountain. That's when I found Sarah Chen. She was hanging from a ledge about 200 feet up, suspended by her climbing harness from a single piton. At first, I thought she might still be alive. People can survive hanging in a harness for hours if they're lucky. But as I got closer, I could see that she wasn't moving, wasn't responding to my calls. The climb to reach her took me almost an hour. The rock was iced over and treacherous, and I had to place protection every few feet to make sure I could get back down safely. When I finally reached the ledge where she hung, what I found made no sense at all. Sarah had been placed there. Not fallen, not blown by wind, placed. Her gear was arranged around her body in a pattern I didn't recognize, forming a rough circle with her ice axes crossed at the head and her ropes coiled in precise spirals. It looked like some kind of ritual, but who could have arranged it? And how had they gotten her body up here without leaving any tracks or ropes? But the most disturbing thing was the expression on her face. I've seen people who died from falls, from exposure, from all the ways the mountains can kill you. They usually look peaceful, or surprised, or scared. Sarah looked odd, like she'd seen something wonderful and terrible just before she died. As I was checking her body for signs of what had killed her, the mountain groaned again, longer this time, deeper. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the rock under my feet and echoing off the peaks around me. That's when I looked up and saw something that shouldn't have been there. High above me, near the summit of Grandfather Mountain, the rock face was moving. Not sliding or falling, moving, shifting and flowing like it was alive. I blinked and looked again, thinking it must be heat, haze, or some trick of the light. But the mountain was definitely changing shape. Walls of granite that I'd climbed 100 times were bulging outward, then settling back into new configurations. And in the center of it all, barely visible against the gray rock, I could swear I saw something that looked like an enormous face. A face that was looking right back at me. I got Sarah's body down from the ledge and used my emergency GPS beacon to mark the location for the recovery team. But even as I was going through the motions, I knew something was hunting me. I could feel it watching from somewhere up in the rocks, something big and patient and old. The prints I'd found weren't the only signs. As I climbed higher, following the route the three mountaineers had taken, I started noticing other changes. Rock formations that looked different from how I remembered them. Climbing holds that had been broken off clean, leaving smooth granite faces where there should have been cracks and ledges. It was like the mountain was rewriting itself. I found Mark Bradley about an hour later. He was on a ledge that shouldn't have existed. According to my maps and my memory, there was supposed to be a sheer wall there, unclimbable without serious technical gear. Instead, there was a narrow shelf of rock about 10 feet wide, and Mark was sitting on it with his back against the mountain face. Like Sarah, he'd been arranged. His climbing gear was spread out around him in that same circular pattern, and he had the same expression of wonder and terror on his face. But Mark showed signs of violence. His climbing helmet was cracked down the middle, and there were marks on his jacket that looked like claw tears. Most disturbing were his hands. They were scraped raw, fingers torn and bloody, like he'd been trying to dig his way into solid rock. The granite behind him showed scratch marks, shallow gouges that followed the pattern of his desperate clawing. I was examining the scene when I heard the first clear sound of whatever was stalking me. Footsteps, heavy, measured, echoing off the rock walls around me. But these weren't coming from any direction I could see. They seemed to be coming from inside the mountain itself, like something enormous was walking through tunnels in the solid rock. My radio crackled to life, and I could hear dispatch trying to reach me. Through the static, I caught a few words. Helicopter crashed, pilot reported. Mountain was moving. Send backup. The radio went dead. Complete silence, not even static. I tried to rappel back down to the main climbing route, but when I reached the end of my rope, I found that the ledge I'd climbed up from was gone, just gone. Smooth granite stretched down for hundreds of feet with no handholds, no cracks, nothing that would have allowed me to climb up in the first place. The mountain had changed while I wasn't looking. I was trapped on a ledge with a dead climber, no way down, and something walking around inside the mountain beneath my feet. For the first time in 17 years of mountain rescue, I was genuinely afraid. That's when Tom Phillips called for help. His voice echoed down from somewhere high above me, weak but unmistakably human. Help, please, I can't get out. I looked up and saw him on what appeared to be the summit of Grandfather Mountain, waving his arms. He was at least 600 feet above me, on terrain that would have taken hours to reach even under perfect conditions. But I could hear him clearly, like he was standing right next to me. Tom, I shouted back. Stay where you are, I'm coming. It's inside the mountain, he called down. It lives inside the mountain. It's been watching us since we got here. I started climbing toward his voice, using every bit of skill I'd learned in 20 years of mountaineering. The route was terrible. Loose rock, ice-covered holds, sections where I had to hammer in protection every few feet just to stay attached to the mountain. But I could hear Tom calling for help, and leaving him wasn't an option. As I climbed, the mountain continued to change around me. Holds that were solid when I grabbed them crumbled away after I'd passed. Cracks that should have provided protection sealed themselves shut behind me. It was like something wanted me to keep climbing higher, but didn't want me to be able to get back down. The footsteps inside the mountain grew louder and more frequent. Sometimes I could feel vibrations through the rock as something massive moved through the internal chambers. Once, I put my ear against the granite and heard what sounded like breathing, slow, deep, the respirations of something enormous. I was about 400 feet up when I found the entrance to the cave. It was a crack in the rock face, maybe 3 feet wide and tall enough for a person to stand in. According to every map I'd ever seen, there were no caves on Grandfather Mountain's north face. But there it was, and Tom's voice was echoing from somewhere inside. "In here," he called. "I'm trapped in here. There's a chamber. God, you have to see this." The smart thing would have been to stay outside and try to talk him into coming out. But Tom sounded hurt, and as a ranger, I couldn't leave an injured person in a cave. I squeezed through the crack and found myself in a passage that led deep into the mountain. The tunnel was smooth, like it had been carved by water over thousands of years. But it was warm inside, much warmer than it should have been. And there was a smell, not unpleasant, but strange, like ozone before a thunderstorm, mixed with something organic and old. I followed Tom's voice deeper into the mountain, using my headlamp to navigate the winding passage. The walls showed strange markings, not natural rock formations, but carved symbols that looked like a mix of Cherokee pictographs and something much older. Some of them seemed to move in my peripheral vision, but when I looked directly at them, they were just marks on stone. "Tom," I called, "keep talking. I'm following your voice." "I can see it," he replied, his voice coming from somewhere ahead. "I can see what lives here. It's beautiful. It's terrible. It's been here since the beginning." The passage opened into a chamber that took my breath away. It was huge, the size of a cathedral, with a domed ceiling that disappeared into darkness above my headlamp's reach. The walls were covered in more of the carved symbols, and in the center of the chamber was something that made no sense at all. A throne, carved from a single piece of granite, 20 feet tall, covered in symbols that seemed to pulse with their own light. And sitting on the throne was the largest human skeleton I'd ever seen. Not human, I realized as I got closer. The proportions were wrong, too tall, too broad, with fingers that ended in what could only be claws. The skull was the size of a basketball, with eye sockets deep enough to hold baseballs. But it wasn't just a skeleton. There was something alive about it, something that watched me as I approached. And lying at the base of the throne, very much alive and staring up at the ancient bones, was Tom Phillips. "It's been waiting," Tom whispered, without taking his eyes off the skeleton. "Waiting for someone who understands. The mountain isn't just rock, Daniel. It's alive. And this is its heart." That's when the skeleton opened its eyes. The eyes weren't bones or empty sockets. They were pools of glacial water, deep blue-green and somehow ancient beyond measure. When they focused on me, I felt a presence in my mind that was vast and patient and utterly alien. Asterisk. "You climb my body without permission," asterisk, a voice said inside my head. Not heard, felt, like the words were carved directly into my thoughts. Asterisk. "You crawl across my skin like insects, driving metal into my flesh, taking pieces of me as trophies." Asterisk. Tom was still lying at the base of the throne, but he was changing. His skin was taking on a grayish tint, and when he turned to look at me, his eyes had the same glacial quality as the thing on the throne. "He showed me," Tom said, but his voice was different now, deeper, like it was coming from somewhere far underground. "Showed me how long he's been here, how many of us he's watched crawl across his peaks, thinking we owned them." The skeleton rose from the throne. It was 20 feet tall, carved from living granite but moving like flesh and bone. As it stood, chunks of rock fell away to reveal something underneath that was neither fully stone nor fully alive. When it stepped down from the throne, the entire chamber shook. Asterisk, "I am Kitowa." Asterisk, the voice in my head said. Asterisk, "I am the mountain's heart, the stone's soul, the ancient guardian of these peaks. For 10,000 years, I have slept while your kind spread across the earth. But now you come with ropes and metal, claiming dominion over what has always been mine." Asterisk. I backed toward the tunnel entrance, but Tom moved to block my path. His skin was almost completely gray now, and when he smiled, his teeth looked like chips of granite. "You can't leave," he said. "He's making us part of the mountain. We'll be the guardians now. We'll protect his domain from the others who would desecrate it." The entity that called itself Kitowa took another step forward, and I could see that what I'd taken for carved granite was actually something organic. Stone skin stretched over muscles of living rock. Veins of quartz and gold ran through its arms like blood vessels. Its claws were obsidian, sharp enough to cut through steel. Asterisk, "You are different from the others." Asterisk, Kitowa said, studying me with those ancient eyes. Asterisk, you have walked my peaks with respect. You understand the old ways. The proper relationship between the mountain and those who would climb it. Asterisk. I've always tried to respect the mountains, I said, surprised that my voice was steady. My grandfather taught me that. Asterisk, your grandfather's grandmother knew my true name. Asterisk, the entity replied. Asterisk, she left offerings at my sacred places and taught her children to ask permission before climbing the high peaks. But that knowledge died with her generation. Now your kind comes with conquest in their hearts, seeking to master what cannot be mastered. Asterisk. Around the chamber, I could see other figures emerging from the shadows. People in climbing gear, but changed like Tom was changing, their skin gray as granite, their eyes reflecting the strange light of the carved symbols. Some I recognized, climbers who had disappeared over the years, people I'd searched for and never found. Sarah and Mark? I asked. Asterisk. They will join us soon. Asterisk, Kitowa said. Asterisk, as will you. The mountain needs guardians who understand both the old world and the new. You will help me protect this place from those who would harm it. Asterisk. But there was something in the entity's voice that gave me hope. It wasn't entirely certain about me. There was a question there. An offer rather than a command. What if I said no? I asked. What if I promised to respect the mountain but stay human? The ancient thing tilted its massive head, considering. Asterisk. You would go back to your kind and tell them what you have seen? Asterisk. I'd tell them that some places are too dangerous to climb, I said. That grandfather mountain should be left alone, made into a preserve or something, protected. Asterisk. And you believe they would listen? Asterisk. I thought about that. About the climbers who came every year, looking for bigger challenges, harder routes. About the developers who wanted to build ski resorts and tourist attractions. About human nature and our need to conquer everything we saw. Some would, I said finally. And I'd stop the ones who wouldn't. Tom laughed, but it sounded like rocks grinding together. He's lying. Humans don't change. They'll keep coming until they've turned every peak into a playground. But Kitowa held up one massive hand, and Tom fell silent. Asterisk, you offer to become my priest rather than my guardian. Asterisk, the entity said. Asterisk, to serve the mountain while remaining human. Asterisk, yes. Asterisk, and if you fail? If others come despite your warnings? Asterisk. I looked around the chamber at the other transformed climbers, at the ancient symbols pulsing with their own light, at the throne carved from living stone. Then you do what you have to do, I said. But give me a chance to try. The silence stretched for a long time. I could hear my own heartbeat, the drip of water somewhere in the darkness, the sound of wind moving through stone passages far above. Finally, Kitowa nodded. Asterisk. You may go. Asterisk, he said. Asterisk. But you will carry my mark, and I will know if you speak falsely or break your word. Fail me, and you will join your friends in eternal service to the mountain. Asterisk. The entity reached out with one massive hand and touched my forehead. Pain shot through my skull like lightning, and for a moment I could see, feel, understand everything, the vast age of the mountains, the slow pulse of geological time, the network of caves and passages that ran through every peak like arteries. When the pain faded, I could still feel a presence at the back of my mind, waiting, watching. Go, Kitowa said aloud. And remember, this mountain lives. Treat it with the reverence it deserves. I don't remember much about getting out of the chamber or climbing down the mountain. One minute I was standing in that ancient throne room. The next I was stumbling into my own cabin as the sun set behind the peaks. My rescue radio was squawking with calls from dispatch, asking for my status and the location of the missing climbers. I told them I'd found 3 bodies, but that recovery would be impossible due to unstable conditions. Avalanche danger, I said, rockfall zones, weather moving in. All true, in their way. The official report listed Mark Bradley, Sarah Chen, and Tom Phillips as victims of exposure and falling rock. The north face of Grandfather Mountain was declared off-limits indefinitely due to extreme geological instability. The families got some closure, and the mountain got some peace. That was 42 years ago. In the decades since, I've done my best to keep my promise to Kitowa. I became the leading advocate for mountain preservation in North Carolina, lobbied for protected status for the high peaks, trained other rangers to recognize and respect the signs that some places are too dangerous for human presence. Most importantly, I've continued doing what I always did, bringing people home safely. But now I have help. The presence in my mind has never left. I can feel Kitowa watching through my eyes sometimes, especially when I'm up on the dangerous peaks. And sometimes, when climbers ignore the warnings and venture into areas they shouldn't, the mountain itself intervenes. Rockfalls that happen just often enough to turn people back. Weather that changes without meteorological explanation. Equipment failures that force retreats, but don't cause serious injury. The mountain has become more subtle in its protection, less violent than it was in 1983. But not always. 3 years ago, a group of extreme climbers decided to attempt a new route up Grandfather's North Face, despite all the warning signs and restricted access notices. They posted videos online about how they were going to conquer the unconquerable peak and prove that modern gear could overcome any natural obstacle. They disappeared on a clear day in perfect weather. I found their base camp set up exactly like the one from 1983. Gear arranged perfectly, no tracks leading away, everything left as if they'd simply vanished into the air. I didn't bother looking for the bodies. I knew where they were. Sometimes, late at night in my cabin, I can hear them, voices echoing down from the high peaks, calling to other climbers. Come see the beautiful chamber, they say. Come see the heart of the mountain. The Mountain King is waiting to meet you. I'm 79 years old now, too old for high-altitude rescue work. They've assigned younger rangers to cover my territory, good people who think the mountain is just rock and ice and wind. I've tried to teach them what my grandfather taught me, but it's hard to explain the old ways to people who've never felt a mountain's heartbeat. Last month, my replacement found something that worried her. Fresh climbing gear scattered on impossible ledges, arranged in circles like some kind of ritual. She asked me about it, wanted to know if I'd ever seen anything like it before. I told her it was probably just rock climbers playing pranks, but I could see she didn't quite believe me. She's young and smart, and she's starting to notice that some of the missing person reports from her sector don't add up. People vanishing from areas where vanishing shouldn't be possible. Tonight, I'm going to take her up to one of the safer peaks and show her how to listen for the mountain's heartbeat, how to recognize the signs that tell you when a place should be left alone. How to feel the difference between rock that's just stone and rock that's something more. Maybe she'll think I'm just a crazy old man telling stories, but maybe she'll understand the way my grandfather hoped I would understand when he first told me about Kitowa. Because the Mountain King is still there, still watching, still protecting his domain, and he's going to need a new priest soon. The mountains are patient, but they're not empty. They never were. And those of us who love them enough to serve them, we make sure they stay that way. Sometimes, when the wind is right and the moon is dark, I can hear him calling from the high peaks, not threatening, not hunting, just reminding me that some places belong to powers older than human memory, and that the best thing we can do is make sure they stay that way. My name is Daniel Ashworth, and I've been a forest ranger for 59 years. In all that time, I've learned one truth that matters more than all the others. Respect the mountains, and they might let you walk away. Disrespect them, and they'll teach you why they were here first. The Mountain King is waiting, patient as stone, old as the earth itself, and he's always listening. My name is Samuel Garrett, and I've been a park ranger for 21 years. Most of that time, I've spent checking on old mining sites scattered throughout Jefferson National Forest in Virginia. It's not the kind of job that makes you famous, but somebody has to do it. These abandoned mines can be dangerous. Cave-ins, poisonous gas, deep water that never sees sunlight. I guess you could say mining runs in my blood. My grandfather worked the coal mines back in the 1940s and 50s. He used to tell me stories about going down into the earth every morning, never knowing if he'd see the sky again. Those stories stuck with me, even after he passed when I was 12. That's probably why I ended up doing this work. Making sure these old places stay sealed up tight, keeping hikers and kids from wandering into places that could kill them. I've documented over 200 abandoned mining sites across these mountains. Each one tells a story, usually a sad one. The Clinch Mountain site was different, though. Always had been. It was August 1988, the kind of summer that makes you feel like you're breathing through a wet towel. I'd been putting off the quarterly inspection of the old Black Rock Coal Company mine for weeks. The site was way up on the mountain, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense forest. Even with my truck's air conditioning running full blast, I was sweating by the time I reached the gate. The mine had been sealed in 1952 after what the company called a tragic accident. 73 men died in an explosion. The official report blamed a gas pocket that nobody saw coming. Case closed, families compensated, mine sealed forever. But I'd done enough research to know the official report was missing some important details. Safety violations, ignored warnings, cost-cutting measures that put profits over people. My grandfather had known some of the men who died that day. He never talked about it much, but when he did, his face would go hard as stone. "Those boys didn't have to die, Sam," he'd told me once. "Company knew that mine wasn't safe. They just didn't care." As I parked my truck and grabbed my equipment, I tried to push those old memories aside. I had a job to do. Check the barriers, test for gas leaks, make sure the warning signs were still clear and readable. Standard procedure. The main entrance was blocked by a heavy steel gate, just like it should be. The concrete barriers looked solid. Everything seemed normal until I walked around to check the secondary entrances. That's when I saw the coal dust. Fresh coal dust, scattered in patterns around the sealed entrance like someone had been digging. But that was impossible. This mine had been dead for 36 years. There was no coal dust left to scatter. I knelt down and touched it with my finger. It was real enough, black as night and gritty between my fingers. I looked closer and felt my stomach do a little flip. The dust wasn't scattered randomly. It formed shapes, almost like letters, crude and uneven, but definitely intentional. Justice. Justice. I stood up quickly, looking around the empty forest. The afternoon heat pressed down on me, but I felt cold suddenly. 21 years of checking these sites, and I'd never seen anything like this. Coal dust doesn't arrange itself into words, and there shouldn't be any fresh dust here anyway. I pulled out my camera and took pictures. Then I collected a sample in a small plastic bag. Maybe there was a logical explanation. Maybe some kids had found coal somewhere else and brought it here as a prank. Maybe the wind had blown dust from another site and coincidentally arranged it into letter-like shapes. But as I drove back down the mountain that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong at the Clinch Mountain site. And that word, justice, kept echoing in my head like a voice calling from deep underground. 3 days later, my radio crackled to life at 6:30 inches the morning. "Sam?" It was Rodriguez, my partner for the past 8 years. He sounded worried. "I'm here, Miguel. What's up?" "Got a call from that environmental survey crew working the Clinch Mountain area. They want to talk to you about the old Black Rock mine. Says it's urgent." I was already reaching for my keys. "What kind of urgent?" "The kind where grown men sound scared, Sam." I met the survey team leader, a guy named Jenkins, at the diner in town. He was maybe 30, college-educated, the kind of person who usually had logical explanations for everything. But his hands shook as he stirred his coffee, and he kept glancing toward the windows like he expected something to be watching him. "We were doing soil samples about half a mile from the mine entrance," Jenkins began. "Yesterday morning, around 8 o'clock, everything was normal at first. Then we started hearing things." "What kind of things?" "Mining sounds, pickaxes hitting rock, the rumble of carts moving on tracks, even voices like men calling to each other down in the tunnels." He paused, rubbing his forehead. "But that mine's been sealed since 1952, right? Nobody's been down there in decades." I nodded. "That's right. What did you do?" "At first, we thought maybe there was another entrance we didn't know about, some kind of illegal operation. We followed the sounds toward the mine, but the closer we got, the quieter everything became. By the time we reached the sealed entrance, there was nothing but silence." Jenkins pulled out a digital recorder, new technology back in '88. "We recorded some of it. Want to hear?" He pressed play, and my blood went cold. Through the static, I could clearly hear the sound of men working. The rhythmic chunk, chunk, chunk of pickaxes, the creak and roll of heavy carts, and underneath it all, voices calling back and forth in the darkness. "Hey, Jimmy, need more timber down here. Watch that gas pocket near Sector 7. Johnson, bring your lamp over here." The voices were clear but distant, like they were coming from very far away. And they sounded old. Not the words themselves, but the way the men spoke. Like something from another time. I turned off the recorder. "You said this was yesterday morning?" Jenkins nodded. "But here's the weird part. We went back this morning to investigate further, and Sam," he pulled out a photograph. "We found this." The picture showed the sealed mine entrance, exactly as I'd left it after my inspection, except now there were fresh lunch pails sitting beside the concrete barrier. Old-fashioned metal pails with wire handles, like the ones miners used to carry their food in. "We didn't touch them," Jenkins continued, "but I could swear I saw steam coming off them, like the food inside was still warm." I stared at the photograph. Those lunch pails hadn't been there 3 days ago. I was certain of that, and if they had been there for any length of time, they'd be rusted and weathered. These looked brand new. "There's something else," Jenkins said quietly. "Temperature readings. Near the mine entrance, our thermometers dropped from 85 degrees to 45 degrees in the space of about 10 feet. For no reason we could figure out. I thought about the coal dust arranged in letters, about the sounds of men who died 36 years ago, about lunch pails that appeared overnight, still warm with food. Did anyone else hear these sounds? My whole crew, 5 people total." Jenkins leaned forward. "Sam, I've been doing environmental surveys for 8 years. I've worked sites all over the country. I've never experienced anything like this. Something's happening up there, and I don't think it's natural." That afternoon, I drove back up to Clinch Mountain alone. Standard protocol said I should wait for backup, but I needed to see for myself. The lunch pails were exactly where Jenkins had photographed them. 5 metal containers, sitting in a neat row like someone had just finished eating and stepped away for a moment. I approached carefully, pulling on rubber gloves before touching anything. The first pail was still warm. Inside, I found a complete lunch from 1952. A sandwich wrapped in wax paper, an apple, a small thermos of coffee that was still steaming. The food looked fresh, like it had been packed that morning, but the newspapers wrapped around the sandwich were yellowed and brittle with age. Headlines from August 1952. The same month the mine exploded. As I examined the second lunch pail, I heard it. Chunk, chunk, chunk. The unmistakable sound of a pickaxe hitting rock, echoing up from somewhere deep underground. I froze, listening. The sound was rhythmic, purposeful. Someone was working down in those sealed tunnels. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed off the mountain and died away. The pickaxe sound stopped immediately. Then, from somewhere far below, I heard a voice call back. "Who's up there? We're trying to work down here." The voice sounded hollow, distant, but unmistakably human, and unmistakably from another time. The accent, the phrasing, even the tone, everything about it belonged to 1952. I backed away from the mine entrance, my heart pounding. Whatever was happening here was beyond anything I'd encountered in 21 years of ranger work. These weren't pranksters or illegal miners. These were the voices of dead men, still working the mine that killed them. I should have called for backup right then. Should have contacted my supervisor, maybe even the state police. But I knew how crazy it would sound. "Hey, Chief, I need help with some ghost miners who are still working shifts 36 years after they died." Instead, I spent the next 2 days researching everything I could find about the Black Rock mine disaster. The official report was thin on details, but I tracked down newspaper archives, survivor interviews, even some of my grandfather's old mining buddies who were still alive. The picture that emerged made my stomach turn. The Black Rock Coal Company knew that mine was dangerous. They'd received multiple warnings about gas pockets in the deeper tunnels. The miners themselves had complained about strange smells and unstable ceiling supports. But the company was behind on their contracts and couldn't afford delays. On the 15th of August 1952, the day shift included 73 men working the deepest part of the mine. According to witnesses, the foreman had ordered them to work sections that should have been condemned. When someone complained about gas readings, He was told to keep digging or find another job. The explosion happened at 2:47 p.m. The blast was so powerful it could be felt in town, 5 miles away. By the time rescue teams reached the affected area, all 73 men were dead. But here's what the official report didn't mention. Several survivors claimed the emergency exits had been blocked. Someone had sealed the escape routes from the outside, trapping the workers in the dangerous sections. When the explosion came, they had nowhere to run. The company paid settlements to the families and sealed the mine permanently. Case closed. No criminal investigation, no accountability. 73 men murdered for profit, and nobody ever paid for their deaths. I was reading through the victim list when my phone rang. It was Rodriguez. Sam, you need to get up to Clinch Mountain right now. That environmental survey team called again. One of their guys is missing. I drove up the mountain faster than I should have, tires slipping on the loose gravel. Rodriguez met me at the mine site along with Jenkins and the rest of his crew. They all looked scared. It's Peterson, Jenkins explained, his voice shaky. He went to check the eastern perimeter this morning. That was 4 hours ago. We've been calling his name, but what? The sounds are back, louder this time. And they're coming from different directions, like the whole mountain is alive with miners. As if to prove his point, we heard it then, the unmistakable sound of men working underground. Pickaxes, shovels, cartwheels on tracks. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing up through the sealed mine shafts. Peterson, Rodriguez called out. Can you hear us? For a moment, there was only the sound of mining. Then, faintly, we heard a voice respond. Down here, I'm down here. But I can't find the way out. The voice was coming from underground, impossible as that seemed. The mine had been sealed with concrete and steel. There was no way anyone could have gotten inside. Where are you, Peterson? I shouted. Level 7, near the coalface. But everything's different down here. The tunnels are working again. There are men everywhere. Jenkins grabbed my arm. That's impossible. Level 7 collapsed in the explosion. It's been buried under tons of rock for 36 years. But Peterson's voice continued, growing more frantic. They want me to work. They're saying I have to finish the shift. Please, somebody help me. I don't want to be here when the explosion comes. The explosion. He was talking about an explosion that had happened 36 years ago, like it was still going to happen. We have to get down there, I said. Rodriguez shook his head. Sam, that mine is sealed. Even if we could get in, it's not safe. Gas pockets, unstable supports, flooded tunnels. Then how did Peterson get inside? Nobody had an answer for that. We spent the next hour searching for any possible entrance Peterson might have used. But every shaft was sealed exactly as it should be. The concrete barriers showed no signs of damage or disturbance. That's when we found Peterson's equipment. His clipboard, radio, and sample bags were scattered around the main entrance like he'd dropped them and run. But there were no footprints leading away from the site. No signs of where he might have gone. Peterson, I called again. His voice came back immediately, but now it sounded different. Flatter, more distant. Can't talk now. Have to work. Foreman says we're behind quota. Have to keep digging. Jenkins went pale. That's not Peterson. That doesn't sound like Peterson at all. He was right. The voice had Peterson's tone, but the words were wrong. Peterson was a college graduate, an environmental scientist. He wouldn't use terms like behind quota or talk about a foreman, but miners from 1952 would. As we stood there trying to make sense of what was happening, the underground sounds grew louder, more insistent. And underneath the working noises, I could hear something else. Men talking, calling to each other in voices that belonged to another time. Johnson, bring that timber over here. Gas readings are spiking in Tunnel 6. Somebody tell the foreman we need to evacuate. Nobody's leaving until we make quota. The last voice was different from the others. Harder. More authoritative. The voice of someone in charge. Someone who didn't care about safety warnings or worker complaints. And somewhere in that chorus of ghostly voices, I heard Peterson again. Please, I just want to go home. I have a family. I don't belong here. But his pleas were drowned out by the sound of pickaxes and the foreman's voice demanding more work. Always more work, no matter the danger. Rodriguez grabbed his radio. This is beyond what we can handle, Sam. I'm calling for emergency rescue teams. But I was starting to understand that emergency teams wouldn't help Peterson. Whatever had taken him existed outside the normal world, in a place where 1,952 and 1,988 existed at the same time. In a place where 73 murdered miners were still trying to finish their final shift. And now they had company. The rescue teams arrived 2 hours later, but I already knew they wouldn't find Peterson through normal means. While they set up equipment and planned their search, I made a decision that probably saved my life and definitely changed it forever. I was going into that mine, not through the sealed entrances. Those were impossible to breach without heavy machinery. But I'd studied the mine layouts for years, and I knew something the rescue teams didn't. There was an old ventilation shaft about a quarter-mile up the mountain. It had been used for air circulation during the mining operation, and while it was officially sealed, it might still be accessible. I told Rodriguez I was going to scout the upper terrain for any sign of Peterson. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The ventilation shaft was exactly where the old maps said it would be, hidden behind 40 years of forest growth. The steel grating over the top had rusted through in several places. With some effort and a lot of stupidity, I managed to squeeze through. The shaft dropped straight down about 30 feet before connecting to the main tunnel system. I rappelled down with climbing gear, my flashlight cutting through darkness that hadn't seen light since 1952. The moment my feet touched the tunnel floor, everything changed. The air got warm and thick, heavy with the smell of coal dust and machine oil. My modern flashlight flickered and went out, but somehow I could still see. The tunnel walls were lined with timber supports that looked freshly cut. Electric cables ran along the ceiling, powering work lights that cast yellow pools of illumination. The tunnels were alive again. I could hear them before I saw them, the miners, working just around the next corner. The chunk of pickaxes, the scrape of shovels, the rumble of carts loaded with coal, and voices calling back and forth in the darkness. "Careful with that timber, boys. Gas pocket in Tunnel 4. Keep that coal moving." I followed the sounds deeper into the mine, my boots echoing on tracks that should have been buried under rubble. The tunnels looked exactly as they would have in 1952. Rough-hewn rock walls, wooden support beams, narrow-gauge railroad tracks running down the center. And then I saw them. The miners were exactly as real as they were impossible. 73 men in work clothes and hard hats, their faces blackened with coal dust, moving through the tunnels with the efficient purpose of people who'd done this job their entire lives. But they were also dead. I could see it in the way light seemed to pass through them sometimes. In the wounds that should have killed them, burns from the explosion, crushing injuries from the collapse. They worked on with broken bones, showing through their skin and terrible burns covering their faces. And in the middle of them, looking confused and terrified, was Peterson. He was dressed like the others now, in rough work clothes and a mining helmet. His modern equipment was gone, replaced by the tools of 1,952. He moved like a sleepwalker, following the motions of mining without understanding why. "Peterson," I called out. He turned toward me, and his eyes were filled with desperate relief. "Sam, thank God. I've been trying to leave, but every time I head for an exit, I'm back here, with the pickaxe in my hands. They want me to work. They say nobody leaves until the shift is done." One of the miners, a big man with burns covering half his face, looked up from his work. "Another one," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the tunnel. "Good. We're behind quota." "Behind quota for what?" I demanded. "You've been dead for 36 years. The burned miner smiled, and it was a terrible sight. "Dead? Son, we just started our shift. Got to get this coal out before." He paused, confusion flickering across his damaged features. "Before something happens. Something bad. But we can't stop working. Foreman's orders." "The foreman who got you killed?" The smile faded. "Don't know what you're talking about. We just work. That's all we do. Work and wait for the explosion," I finished. All 73 miners stopped what they were doing and looked at me. The tunnel fell silent except for the distant drip of water and the creak of old timber. "Explosion?" one of them asked softly. "The 15th of August, 1952, I said. At 2:47 p.m. a gas pocket ignited in Tunnel 6. 73 men died because the company locked the emergency exits. Because they cared more about coal than lives." The miners looked at each other, confusion and growing horror on their faces. One by one, they began to remember the gas warnings, the blocked exits, the foreman's orders to keep working no matter what. They trapped us, the burned miner whispered. They knew it was dangerous, and they trapped us down here. We tried to run, another added, his voice broken. When the gas got thick, we tried to reach the exits. But they were sealed. Someone had sealed them from the outside. Murder, a third miner said, the word echoing through the tunnels. They murdered us for coal. The temperature in the tunnel dropped 20 degrees in an instant. The lights flickered, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the rumble of an approaching explosion. It's starting again, Peterson said, his face pale with terror. The whole day starts over again. Every day, we work the shift and die in the explosion. Every day, we try to escape and can't. We're trapped here forever. No, I said firmly. You're not trapped, you're waiting. Waiting for what? Justice. Someone to tell the truth about what happened here. Someone to make sure the world knows you were murdered. The burned miner stepped closer. You'll tell them? You'll tell them what the company did? I'm a park ranger, I said. I document mining sites. I write reports. If you let Peterson and me leave, I'll write a report that tells the whole truth. The real story of what happened on the 15th of August, 1952. The rumble was getting closer now. The explosion that had killed them was approaching through time, ready to claim them again. But for the first time in 36 years, they had a choice. You promise? The miner asked. You promise to tell them we didn't die in no accident, that we were murdered? I promise. The miners looked at each other, having a silent conversation that lasted 36 years in the space of a heartbeat. Then, one by one, they nodded. Go, the burned miner said. Go before the explosion comes. And remember us, remember our names. Peterson and I ran through tunnels that were already beginning to collapse around us. Not from present-day cave-ins, but from an explosion that happened decades ago. Behind us, I could hear the miners singing an old coal mining song, their voices growing fainter as we climbed toward the surface. We reached the ventilation shaft, just as the rumble became a roar. I pushed Peterson up first, then hauled myself out into the modern world, just as the ground beneath us shook with the force of an explosion that existed in 1952 and 1988 and every day in between. The official report I filed 3 weeks later was unlike anything I'd written in 21 years of ranger work. It included everything: the environmental survey team's recordings, the physical evidence we'd collected, interviews with descendants of the dead miners, and a detailed investigation into the BlackRock Coal Company's safety violations. But most importantly, it included the names. All 73 of them, along with their ages, families, and the circumstances of their deaths. I made sure everyone understood they hadn't died in an accident. They'd been murdered by a company that valued coal more than human life. The report caused a bigger stir than I expected. Newspapers picked up the story. Historians got involved. The families of the dead miners finally had official acknowledgement of what they'd always known. Their fathers and husbands and brothers had been sacrificed for profit. A memorial was built at the site, listing all 73 names and the truth about their deaths. Peterson left environmental surveying after what happened. Last I heard, he was teaching high school science in Ohio, about as far from mines as he could get. He never talked about what happened in those tunnels, but sometimes when he called to check in, I could hear the relief in his voice. Relief that he'd escaped something that had no intention of ever letting him go. As for me, I stayed on as a ranger for another 12 years before retiring. I continued documenting abandoned mining sites, but now I paid more attention to the stories they told. How many other sites held secrets like Clinch Mountain? How many other groups of workers had died for corporate greed and been forgotten? I never heard the miners again after that day. The mountain fell silent, the way it should have been all along. But sometimes, when I drive past the memorial, I think I can see them in the distance, 73 figures standing quietly among the trees, finally at peace. They got their justice in the end. Not the legal kind. The men responsible were long dead by 1988. But they got something maybe more important. They got remembered. They got their names carved in stone, and their story told truly. Sometimes that's all the dead really want, for someone to remember that they lived, and to make sure everyone knows how they died. The Clinch Mountain mine stays sealed now, and the forest has reclaimed most of the mining roads. But the memorial stands, And every August 15th, people still come to leave flowers and remember 73 men who went to work one morning and never came home. Because someone finally told their story. Someone finally gave them justice. My name is Jacob Treadwell, and I've been a ranger in Pisgah National Forest for 16 years now. Before that, I spent 8 years with the ATF, chasing bootleggers through these same mountains. I know every hidden trail, every cave system, and every trick these mountain folks use to hide their stills. Or at least, I thought I did. People ask me why I left federal law enforcement for Park Service work. The pay's worse, that's for sure. But after years of kicking down doors and arresting men whose families had been making moonshine since before there were laws against it, I started to understand something. These mountains have their own rules, their own ways. Sometimes it's better to work with the land instead of against it. The Linville Gorge area where I patrol is some of the roughest country in North Carolina. Deep ravines cut through rock that's older than dinosaurs. Caves honeycomb the cliffs like Swiss cheese. Most of them have never been mapped. Some of them probably never will be. It was September 1979 when things started getting strange. The leaves were just beginning to turn, and the air had that crisp edge that made you think of wood smoke and harvest time. Perfect weather for making moonshine, if you were the type to do such things. I was checking a trail near the gorge when Mrs. Henderson from the visitor center radioed me. A hiking group had reported something odd, the smell of cooking mash and wood smoke coming from an area where no one lived. No permits had been issued for camping in that zone. Probably just some old boy running a still, I told her. I'll check it out. I'd busted more than 50 illegal operations during my career. I knew the signs. The sweet, sour smell of fermenting corn, the sound of bubbling water, the careful way bootleggers picked their spots, always near fresh water, always hidden from view, always with 2 ways out in case of trouble. But as I hiked toward the coordinates Mrs. Henderson had given me, something felt different. The forest was too quiet. No bird sounds. Even the insects seemed to have gone silent. My boots crunched through leaves that shouldn't have been falling yet. I've always been practical about my job. 16 years in these mountains teaches you to trust your instincts, but I don't believe in ghosts or spirits or any of that mountain superstition stuff. When something goes bump in the night, there's usually a perfectly reasonable explanation. Still, as I got closer to the area the hikers had reported, the hair on my neck started standing up. The air smelled wrong. Not just the mash smell, something else. Something like sulfur mixed with old meat. I found the trail that led down into the gorge. It wasn't on any map I'd ever seen, but bootleggers are good at making trails that look natural. This one switched back down the cliff face, barely wide enough for a man carrying supplies. The smell got stronger as I descended, definitely mash cooking. But there was something else, a chemical smell that made my eyes water. In my ATF days, I'd seen stills that used car radiators for condensers. The antifreeze would leak into the moonshine and poison anyone who drank it. Maybe that was what I was smelling. The trail ended at a cave opening about 20 feet wide. Fresh scratches in the rock around the entrance showed that heavy equipment had been moved in and out recently. I could hear the sound of running water from inside, always a good sign for a still operation. I pulled out my flashlight and checked my radio. The signal was weak, this deep in the gorge, but I could probably get through if I needed backup. "This is Ranger Treadwell," I radioed. "Investigating possible illegal still operation in Sector 7. Going in now." Mrs. Henderson's voice crackled back, barely audible. "Copy that, Jacob. Be careful down there." I clicked the radio back on my belt and stepped into the cave. The cave opened up into a chamber about the size of a basketball court. My flashlight beam swept across the walls, and I stopped cold. Someone had built the most elaborate moonshine operation I'd ever seen. Copper tubing ran everywhere, connecting a massive still to a series of barrels and condensers. A fire burned in a stone pit, heating a huge copper pot that bubbled and steamed. The whole setup looked like it could produce 50 gallons a day. But there was no one there. I called out, "Forest Service, anyone in here?" My voice echoed off the cave walls. No answer. I stepped closer to the still. It was running full blast, fire hot, mash bubbling, clear liquid dripping from the condenser into mason jars. Someone had been here very recently. The fire was fresh. The mash smelled like it was at the perfect temperature. But where was the operator? I walked around the whole chamber, checking every shadow and corner. Nobody. No sign that anyone had been here in the last few minutes. No warm coffee cup, no coat hung on a rock, nothing. I keyed my radio. Mrs. Henderson, this is strange. Found a still running full operation, but there's nobody here. Static answered me. I tried again, nothing. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The equipment wasn't modern. The copper work was all hand-hammered, with joints soldered the old way. The design was from the 1922, maybe earlier. But it looked brand new. I'd seen museum pieces that looked more worn than this still. I took out my notebook and started documenting everything. Location, equipment description, estimated production capacity, standard procedure, but my hands were shaking, and I couldn't figure out why. The fire never seemed to get lower, even though I didn't see any fresh wood nearby. The mash kept bubbling at exactly the same rate. The clear liquid kept dripping into the jars, one drop every 3 seconds, like a metronome. I was about to take a sample when I heard footsteps. Boot heels on stone, coming from deeper in the cave. Slow, deliberate steps. "Forest Service," I called out. "I need to speak with you." The footsteps stopped. I aimed my flashlight toward the back of the cave. The beam disappeared into a tunnel I hadn't noticed before, dark as the inside of a grave. "Sir, ma'am? I'm Ranger Treadwell. I just need to talk to you about your operation here." Silence. Then the footsteps started again, but now they were circling around me, staying just outside my flashlight beam. I spun around, trying to track the sound. It was like playing hide and seek with someone who knew these caves better than I knew my own backyard. "Look," I said, keeping my voice calm, "I'm not ATF anymore. I'm not here to arrest anybody. Just need to make sure this operation is safe." A voice answered from the darkness. Low, gravelly, like a man who'd been smoking for 50 years. "Ain't nothing unsafe about my work, Ranger man. Been making the finest moonshine in these mountains for longer than you've been alive." I turned toward the voice, but my flashlight beam hit empty air. "Could you step out where I can see you, sir? Just want to have a conversation." A laugh echoed through the cave. Not a pleasant sound. "Oh, you'll see me soon enough. Question is, you gonna stick around long enough for a taste? This here's the best moonshine ever made. Got a special recipe. Secret ingredient." I backed toward the cave entrance. Something about that voice made my skin crawl. It didn't sound quite right. Like the words were being spoken underwater, or from very far away. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm on duty. Can't drink on the job." "That's a shame, Ranger man. Real shame. Once you taste my moonshine, nothing else ever satisfies. Folks keep coming back for more, and more, and more." I was almost to the cave entrance when I heard something that stopped me dead. Another set of footsteps. Young voices, laughing and talking. 3 teenagers emerged from the tunnel in the back of the cave. 2 boys and a girl, maybe 16 or 17 years old. They walked straight to the still, like they owned the place. "Hey," I shouted, "you kids need to get out of here right now. This is dangerous." They turned to look at me, and my blood went cold. Their eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, the whole eye, like looking into deep water at night. And they were smiling, but not with their mouths. The smiles were in their eyes, cold and hungry. "Ranger man," the girl said in a voice too old for her face, "you should try some of this moonshine. It's real good. Makes you feel different." One of the boys was already filling a mason jar from the still. The clear liquid looked normal enough, but when he held it up to my flashlight, it seemed to move on its own. Like there was something swimming in it. "I'm ordering you to leave this cave immediately," I said, reaching for my radio. The teenagers just laughed. All 3 of them, at the same time, in perfect harmony. It was the most unnatural sound I'd ever heard. That's when I ran. I burst out of that cave like the devil himself was chasing me. Which, thinking back on it now, might not be far from the truth. I scrambled up the narrow trail, loose rocks sliding under my boots. Behind me, I could hear that horrible laughter echoing out of the cave. It followed me all the way to the top of the gorge. My radio crackled to life as soon as I reached higher ground. "Jacob? Jacob, are you there?" Mrs. Henderson's voice was full of worry. "You've been out of contact for 2 hours." "2 hours?" I checked my watch. It was past 5 in the afternoon. I'd gone into that cave at 3:15, but it had felt like maybe 20 minutes. "I'm here," I said. "Send a car to pick me up at the gorge trailhead, and call the sheriff's department. We've got miners in a dangerous situation down there." By the time Sheriff Williams arrived with backup, the sun was setting behind the mountains. I told him about the still, about the teenagers with the black eyes. He listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. Jim Williams had been sheriff for 12 years. He'd seen enough strange things in these mountains to keep an open mind. "You sure about those kids?" he asked. "The Henderson twins went missing 3 days ago, 16 years old, both of them. And there was a boy from town, Tommy Morrison. His folks reported him gone yesterday." My stomach clenched. "What did they look like?" Jim described them. It matched what I'd seen perfectly. We went down into the cave with 4 deputies and enough flashlights to light up a football field. The still was still running, fire burning bright, mash bubbling away. But there was no sign of the teenagers. "This equipment," one of the deputies said, running his hand along the copper tubing. "This is old. Really old." Jim was examining the mason jars filled with clear liquid. "Jacob, you said you saw kids drinking this?" I nodded. He held up one of the jars to his flashlight. The moonshine looked normal now, just clear liquid, like it should be. But I could have sworn there had been something moving in it before. "We better get this tested," Jim said. "Could be poison. Could be why those kids were acting strange." We spent 3 hours documenting everything. Taking photos, collecting samples, measuring the cave dimensions. Standard police work. But the whole time, I felt like we were being watched. Jim assigned 2 deputies to guard the cave overnight while we waited for the lab results. I went home to my cabin on the other side of the forest, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those black eyes and heard that unnatural laughter. At 2 in the morning, my phone rang. "Jacob?" It was Jim, and he sounded shaken. "You need to get out here, now." "What happened?" "My deputies. They're gone. And there's something else, something you need to see." I threw on my clothes and drove through the dark mountain roads faster than was safe. When I got to the gorge, Jim was standing at the trailhead with a flashlight that trembled in his hand. "They're not responding to radio calls," he said. "Been trying for an hour." We went down the trail together. The cave mouth yawned open like a hungry mouth. Jim's flashlight beam penetrated about 10 feet into the darkness before it seemed to get swallowed up. "Deputies Morrison and Blake went down around midnight," Jim said. "Supposed to check in every 30 minutes. We found them at the still, both of them sitting on rocks, drinking moonshine from mason jars. Their eyes were completely black, just like the teenagers." "Evening, Sheriff," Deputy Morrison said, in a voice that wasn't quite his own. "Care for a drink? This here's the finest moonshine in North Carolina." Jim drew his gun. "Blake, Morrison, what the hell is wrong with you?" Deputy Blake laughed. "Nothing wrong, boss. Everything's perfect. Never felt better in my life." That's when I saw him. Standing in the shadows behind the still, watching us with eyes like burning coals, a man in overalls and a torn shirt, his face half melted like he'd been in a fire. When he smiled, his teeth were black as pitch. "Welcome back, Ranger Man," he said. "I see you brought friends. Always got room for more in my operation." Jim's gun was shaking in his hands. "Who are you? What did you do to my men?" And the burned man stepped into the light, and I saw the full horror of him. His skin hung in tatters, his hair was singed down to his skull, and burned into his forehead was a symbol that looked like a backwards cross with extra lines. "Name's Ezekiel Hawkins," he said. "Been making moonshine in these mountains since 1924. Got a special deal, you see, special contract. Makes the finest liquor you ever tasted, and all it costs is your soul." Jim fired his gun. The bullet went right through Hawkins like he was made of smoke. The burned man just laughed. "Can't kill what's already dead, Sheriff, but you can join us. All you gotta do is take one sip, one taste of my special recipe, and you'll never want to leave." Deputy Morrison stood up, moving like a sleepwalker. "Come on, Sheriff. It's good, really good. Makes all your troubles go away." That's when I noticed something carved into the cave wall. Words burned into the rock like they'd been written with acid. Asterisk, Ezekiel Hawkins, sold soul to the devil for the perfect moonshine recipe. September 21, 1924. Asterisk. Below that, in fresher burns, Tommy Morrison, September 12, 1979. Sarah Henderson, September 12, 1979. Michael Henderson, September 12, 1979. Deputy James Blake, September 15, 1979. Deputy Thomas Morrison, September 15, 1979. The wall was covered with names, dozens of them, some carved deep and old, others fresh and still smoking. Jim saw what I was looking at. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "He ain't got nothing to do with this," Hawkins said. "This here's devil's work, and business has been real good lately." The temperature in the cave dropped 20 degrees in the space of a heartbeat. Our breath came out in white puffs, and frost started forming on the copper tubing. "Sheriff Williams," Deputy Blake said, his voice dreamy and distant, "you should really try this moonshine. It makes everything so clear, so simple." Both deputies started walking toward us, mason jars in their hands. Their black eyes reflected our flashlight beams like an animal's eyes in headlights. "Jim," I said quietly, "we need to get out of here, now." But the cave entrance was blocked. 3 more figures stood silhouetted against the night. The missing teenagers, their heads tilted at impossible angles. "No one leaves," the Henderson girl said. "Mr. Hawkins needs more workers, more souls for his special recipe." Hawkins stepped closer, and the smell of sulfur and burning meat got stronger. "See, Ranger man, I made me a deal back in 24. Times were hard, revenue agents everywhere, couldn't make a decent living. Then this fella comes to me, nicely dressed, real polite, and offers me a bargain. Perfect moonshine recipe in exchange for my soul." He gestured toward the still, with a burned, skeletal hand. "Thought I was getting a good deal, figured I'd make my fortune and retire rich. Didn't read the fine print." "What fine print?" Jim asked, though his voice was shaking. "Contract says, I gotta keep making moonshine forever. And anyone who tastes it, their soul belongs to my new boss too. Been running this operation for 55 years now. Some folks call it hell. I call it job security." The deputies were getting closer. Behind them, I could see more figures emerging from the deeper tunnels, dozens of them, men and women in clothes from different time periods, some from the 1922, others more recent, all with the same black eyes. "This is impossible," Jim whispered. "Lot of things in these mountains folks call impossible," Hawkins said. Cherokee knew better. They called this place cursed long before white folks ever showed up. Devils got roots here deeper than the oldest trees. I backed against the cave wall and felt something wet on my fingers. Water was seeping through the rock. Mountain spring water, ice cold and clean. That's when I remembered something my grandmother used to tell me. Cherokee stories about sacred springs that could wash away evil spirits. About water, blessed by the old ways that could break curses. I cupped my hands and caught as much of the spring water as I could. "You want some sacred water?" I said to Hawkins. "Cherokee-blessed springs. Let's see how your devil's contract stands up to that." I threw the water at the burning man. He screamed like a wildcat caught in a trap. Where the water hit him, his burned flesh started smoking and cracking. The symbol on his forehead began to fade. "No," he howled. "You don't understand. If you break the contract, all these souls go back where they came from. They've been dead for decades." The cave started shaking. Rocks fell from the ceiling. The still's fire went out with a sound like a thunderclap. All around us, the people with black eyes stopped moving. They turned to look at Hawkins with expressions of confusion and fear. "What's happening?" Deputy Morrison said in his own voice. "Where are we?" The teenagers looked around the cave like they were waking up from a bad dream. "How did we get here?" Sarah Henderson asked. I kept splashing spring water on everything I could reach. The still, the walls, the floor. Each drop seemed to burn away a piece of the darkness. Hawkins was falling apart like a scarecrow in a windstorm. 55 years, he moaned. 55 years of service. He promised me eternal life. He gave you eternal slavery, I said. Time to let go. A voice echoed through the cave, deeper than thunder, colder than winter wind. It spoke words in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow I understood. The devil was not pleased. The cave shook harder. Cracks appeared in the walls. Water poured from the spring faster now, forming a stream that ran toward the back tunnels. "We have to get out of here," I shouted. "The whole place is coming down." Jim grabbed the two deputies and started pushing them toward the entrance. I helped the teenagers, their eyes slowly returning to normal colors. Hawkins made one last desperate lunge at us. "If I can't have your souls, I'll take your lives." I threw the last of the spring water right in his face. He disintegrated like ash in a windstorm. The symbol on the cave wall cracked and crumbled. The devil's contract was broken. We ran for the entrance as the mountain itself seemed to be trying to crush us. Rocks fell like rain. The sound of rushing water filled the tunnels behind us. We made it out just as the cave entrance collapsed. Tons of rock sealed the devil's moonshine operation forever, or at least until someone else was foolish enough to dig it up. The teenagers had no memory of the last 3 days. The deputies remembered going into the cave, but nothing after that. Jim decided to report it as a rock slide caused by underground spring activity. No mention of supernatural moonshine or deals with the devil. "Who's going to believe it anyway?" he said. I spent the next week researching Ezekiel Hawkins. Found his name in county records from 1924. He'd been found dead in a cave-in at his illegal still operation. Body so burned, the coroner couldn't determine cause of death. The cave had been sealed and forgotten, until now. I also found something else in the old records. References to other deals made in other parts of the mountains. Cherokee stories about white men who sold their souls for various reasons. Gold, land, perfect crops, beautiful wives. Most of them ended badly. Mrs. Henderson transferred to a park in Tennessee the following month. Said she needed a change of scenery. Jim Williams retired early and moved to Florida. The deputies requested transfers to other counties. I stayed. Someone has to keep an eye on these mountains. Someone has to know which places are safe and which ones should be left alone. These hills are old, older than human memory. The Cherokee understood that. They knew there were powers here that demanded respect. I learned to carry a water bottle filled from the sacred spring. Cherokee elder named Joseph Crow Dog taught me the proper blessings. He didn't seem surprised when I told him what had happened. "White man always thinks he can make deals with forces he doesn't understand," he said. "Mountain spirits don't care about your contracts and laws. They follow older rules." Sometimes, late at night, when I'm patrolling the deep woods, I smell wood smoke and cooking mash. I hear the sound of bubbling stills from places where no stills should be. I find mason jars filled with clear liquid sitting on tree stumps like offerings. I pour them out and say a prayer. The Cherokee were right. These mountains are alive, and they remember everything. Every deal, every betrayal, every soul sold for temporary gain. The devil may have lost his claim on Ezekiel Hawkins, but he's got plenty of other contracts throughout these hills. My job now is to make sure no one else stumbles into those old agreements. To watch for signs of supernatural activity and deal with it before it spreads. It's not the career I planned when I joined the Park Service. But it's necessary work, because in these ancient mountains, the past never really dies. It just waits underground, patient as stone, for the next person foolish enough to make a deal with darkness. And there's always someone willing to sell their soul for the perfect moonshine. My name is Margaret Thornfield, and I've been a park ranger in West Virginia's Cranberry Wilderness for 15 years. People always ask me why I chose this job. The truth is, I love plants. I have a degree in botany, and there's something magical about how things grow in these ancient mountains. I know every trail, every creek, and every plant species in my section of the Monongahela National Forest. At least, I thought I did until May of 1985. The Cranberry Wilderness is special. It's 25 miles from the nearest road, and most visitors never make it past the easy trails. But I love the deep places, especially Whispering Creek. The water runs cold and clear, fed by mountain springs that have been flowing for thousands of years. The soil around that creek is rich and dark, perfect for growing things. I've collected folk remedies from the old-timers in the area for years. Mountain people have always known which plants heal and which ones hurt. They passed down this knowledge from their grandparents, who learned it from their grandparents. Some of the stories go back to the 1700s, when the first settlers came to these hills. That's when I first heard about the witch. Old Mary Hoskins told me the story, one rainy afternoon. She was 87 and sharp as a tack. Her family had been in these mountains since before the Revolutionary War. There was a woman lived by Whispering Creek, Mary said, rocking in her chair. This was back in 1742. She knew plants better than anybody. When folks got sick, they went to her. She could cure fever, stop bleeding, ease pain. But when the sickness came, the big sickness that killed whole families, people got scared. What kind of sickness? I asked. Some kind of plague. Children dying in their beds, grown men falling over in the fields. The woman by the creek worked day and night, trying to save folks with her herbs, but people started whispering, said she must be causing the sickness. Why else would she be the only one who didn't get sick? Mary's voice dropped low. They burned her alive, right there by the creek where she gathered her healing plants. They said she was a witch. That's terrible, I said. Story goes, she cursed them as she died. Said the plants would remember. Said they'd know the difference between those who heal and those who hurt. Mary looked out the window toward the mountains. Folks still won't gather herbs by that creek. Say the plants there ain't right. I laughed it off back then. I'm a scientist. I believe in soil chemistry and growing seasons, not curses. But I made a note to check out Whispering Creek more carefully. If there really were unusual plants there, it could be because of the mineral content in the water, or maybe the way the valley protected certain species from harsh weather. That was my first mistake, thinking science could explain everything. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. Dr. James Peters from the university was bringing a research team to study rare plant species in the wilderness. They'd gotten permission to take samples from several areas, including Whispering Creek. They're looking for plants that might have medical value. My supervisor told me, "You know the area better than anyone. I want you to guide them." I was excited. It's not often I get to work with real researchers. Maybe we'd discover something important. Maybe we'd find new ways to use the old healing plants. I met the team at the ranger station on Wednesday morning. Dr. Peters was a thin man with thick glasses and nervous hands. His assistant, Dr. Sarah Chen, was young and enthusiastic. They had 2 graduate students with them, plus enough equipment to study every leaf and root in the forest. We're particularly interested in plants that show unusual growth patterns, Dr. Peters explained as we loaded their gear. Plants that grow in combinations that shouldn't work or in soil that shouldn't support them. Like what? I asked. Well, we've heard reports of medicinal plants growing right next to poisonous ones. Plants that normally need different soil types growing side by side. Things that don't make sense according to normal botanical principles. We hiked out to Whispering Creek that afternoon. It's a beautiful spot, a narrow valley where the water runs shallow over smooth stones. Ancient hemlock trees block out most of the sunlight, keeping everything cool and damp. The moment we stepped into the valley, I knew something was different. The plants were wrong. I can't explain it any other way. I know every plant in these mountains, and I know where they're supposed to grow. But here, by Whispering Creek, everything was mixed up. Bloodroot was growing right next to foxglove. Anyone who knows plants will tell you that's impossible. Bloodroot likes rich, moist soil under hardwood trees. Foxglove prefers sandy, acidic ground in open areas. They shouldn't even be in the same forest, let alone growing from the same patch of earth. But there they were, their roots tangled together like old friends. This is fascinating, Dr. Peters said, setting up his equipment. Sarah, get soil samples from around each plant cluster. Dr. Chen knelt down with her collection kit. The moment her gloved hand touched the soil near a group of ginseng plants, she jerked back with a yelp. What's wrong? I asked. She pulled off her glove. Her palm was covered with red welts, like she'd grabbed a handful of poison ivy. I don't understand, she said. The glove should have protected me, and there's no poison ivy here. I looked closer at the plants she'd been sampling. Ginseng, golden seal, and wild ginger, all valuable medicinal plants, all perfectly safe to touch. I'd handled them hundreds of times. Let me try, I said, reaching toward the same spot. Don't. Dr. Peters grabbed my wrist. If it burned through her gloves. These are healing plants, I said. They don't hurt people. But even as I said it, I felt a chill run down my spine. The plants looked wrong somehow. Their leaves were too green, their stems too thick, and there was a smell in the air, sweet and rotting at the same time. We moved to a different spot, but the same thing happened. Dr. Chen tried to take samples from what looked like perfectly normal herbs, and her equipment started giving impossible readings. "The pH meter says this soil is both highly acidic and highly alkaline," she said, checking her instruments. "That's not possible." "Maybe the equipment is broken," suggested Mike, one of the graduate students. But when they tested other areas, everything worked fine. It was only here, around these specific plant clusters, that the readings went crazy. That's when we heard the sound. It was faint at first, a rhythmic grinding, like someone crushing seeds with a mortar and pestle. The sound seemed to come from deeper in the valley, where the creek disappeared around a bend. "Someone's out there," Dr. Peters said. "No," I shook my head. "The nearest trail is miles from here. Nobody else should be in this area." But the grinding continued, steady and purposeful. Mixed in with it, I could hear other sounds, the rustle of leaves being sorted, the clink of glass containers, the soft murmur of a woman's voice. "Should we check it out?" Mike asked. I didn't want to. Every instinct I had was screaming that we should leave this valley and not come back. But I'm a ranger. It's my job to know who's in my forest and what they're doing. "Stay together," I said, "and don't touch anything else." We followed the creek deeper into the valley. The trees grew thicker here, their branches forming a canopy so dense that it felt like walking through a green tunnel. The sound of grinding grew louder, joined now by other noises, the crackling of a fire, the bubble of boiling water. The smell got stronger too, sweet herbs mixed with something bitter and medicinal. It should have been pleasant, but it made my stomach turn. We rounded the bend in the creek and found the source of the sounds. There was a garden. It shouldn't have been there. I'd hiked this valley dozens of times, and I'd never seen any kind of cleared area. But there it was, a perfect circle of cultivated ground, maybe 30 feet across. Rows of herbs grew in neat lines, each plant healthy and full. A small fire burned in a stone circle, with an iron pot hanging over it. Steam rose from the pot, carrying that sweet bitter smell. But there was no one there. "Where did the sounds come from?" Sarah whispered. As if in answer, the grinding started again. But now I could see the mortar and pestle, sitting on a flat rock near the fire. It was moving by itself, crushing what looked like dried roots into powder. Dr. Peters pulled out his camera, but when he tried to take a picture, it wouldn't work. The battery was dead, even though he'd charged it that morning. "We should go," I said. "Something's not right here." That's when Tom, the other graduate student, made his mistake. He saw a plant he didn't recognize and reached out to touch it. It looked harmless, small white flowers on a delicate green stem. But the moment his fingers made contact, he screamed and fell to his knees. His hand was turning black. Not just bruised or burned, actually black, like frostbite, but spreading fast up his arm. The blackness crept under his skin, following his veins. "Get him out of here," I shouted. We grabbed Tom and ran, crashing through the underbrush toward the main trail. Behind us, I could hear laughter, high and cold and definitely female. The grinding sound had stopped, but now there were footsteps following us, crunching through dead leaves. I didn't look back until we reached the ranger station. Tom was unconscious by then, his whole arm black to the shoulder. We called for emergency evacuation, and the helicopter took him to the hospital in Charleston. The doctors said they'd never seen anything like it. They couldn't explain what had caused the tissue damage, and they couldn't stop it from spreading. Tom died 3 days later. The official cause of death was listed as unknown toxic exposure. But I knew better. Whatever was in that valley by Whispering Creek, it didn't want visitors. After Tom's death, the university canceled the research project. Dr. Peters packed up his equipment and left without saying goodbye. Dr. Chen was transferred to a hospital for treatment of her chemical burns, which had started getting worse instead of better. My supervisor wanted to close the area to all visitors, but I talked him out of it. I needed to go back. I needed to understand what had happened. The problem was, I couldn't find the garden again. I hiked back to Whispering Creek a week later, this time alone and armed with every piece of safety equipment I owned. Full protective suit, respirator, chemical detection devices, everything I could think of. But when I got to the spot where we'd found the garden, there was nothing there. Just normal forest floor, covered with fallen leaves. No cleared area, no fire pit, no carefully planted rows of herbs. Even the rock where I'd seen the mortar and pestle was gone. I spent hours searching, but found nothing unusual. The strange plant combinations were gone too. Everything was growing exactly where it should be, just like a normal forest. I started to think I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe the stress of losing Tom had made me see things that weren't there. Maybe the garden had been some kind of hallucination brought on by bad air in the valley. But then the plants started appearing in other places. First, it was just a few odd combinations near the creek. Herbs that shouldn't grow together, showing up in impossible locations. I documented everything, taking pictures and soil samples, but every time I came back to check on them, they'd be gone. It was like the forest was playing games with me. The real trouble started when hikers began getting sick. A family from Ohio came through in June. They were experienced backpackers, well-prepared and careful. But they made camp near Whispering Creek, and the next morning their 8-year-old daughter was covered in blisters. She just touched a plant to look at it, the mother told me, tears running down her face. It looked like a wildflower. How could a wildflower do this? I examined the plant she described. It was definitely a wildflower, something that should have been completely harmless. But when I tried to touch it myself, my skin started tingling before I even made contact. The little girl spent 2 weeks in the hospital. She lived, but the scars on her hands never completely went away. 2 days later, an elderly man collapsed on the trail near the creek. He'd been gathering wild berries, something he'd done safely for 60 years. But these berries, though they looked normal, had made him violently ill. He barely survived the helicopter ride to the hospital. I started putting up warning signs, but it didn't help. The dangerous plants kept moving. A patch of innocent-looking herbs would be safe one day, deadly the next. There was no pattern I could find, no way to predict which plants would hurt people. That's when I started hearing her. It began as whispers on the wind when I hiked alone in the valley. Soft words I couldn't quite understand, like someone talking to themselves while they worked. The voice was definitely female, with an accent I couldn't place, something old-fashioned, maybe from the colonial period. At first, I only heard it during the day, but then the whispers started following me home. I'd be lying in bed at night and hear that same voice drifting through my window, talking about herbs and healing and the ungrateful people who didn't understand her work. Sometimes she'd laugh, a sound like breaking glass that made my teeth hurt. My neighbors didn't hear anything. When I asked around, nobody else had noticed unusual sounds. It was just me. I started sleeping with earplugs, but it didn't help. The voice wasn't coming through my ears, it was coming from inside my head. "You know plants," she whispered to me one night. "You understand their power. Why do you fight me?" I sat up in bed, heart pounding. "Who are you?" But there was only silence. The next morning, I found my garden destroyed. Every plant I'd been growing was withered and black, as if they'd been burned from the inside. But there was no fire damage, no sign that anyone had been in my yard. That's when I knew for certain. The witch by Whispering Creek was real, and she was getting stronger. I decided to fight back the only way I knew how. I started researching the history of the area, looking for any records of the woman who'd been burned in 1742. If I could understand what had happened to her, maybe I could figure out how to stop her. What I found in the old courthouse records made my blood run cold. Her name had been Mercy Blackwood. She'd been 28 years old when she died, with a reputation as the best healer in the valley. According to the court documents, she'd saved dozens of lives during the plague that struck the settlement that year. But the plague had been strange. It didn't follow normal patterns. Some houses would be completely spared while others lost everyone. People started blaming Mercy, saying she was choosing who lived and who died. The truth was, in a letter written by one of the surviving settlers, Mercy had been trying to cure the plague using traditional remedies, but the disease was unlike anything she'd seen before. In her desperation, she'd started experimenting with new combinations of plants, mixing healing herbs with more dangerous ones. Some of her treatments had worked, but others had made people sicker or killed them outright. The settlers didn't understand that she was trying to help. All they saw was a woman whose medicine sometimes healed and sometimes killed. In their fear and grief, they decided she must be using dark magic. They tied her to a stake in the garden where she'd grown her healing plants. As the flames consumed her, she'd cursed them all, swearing that her knowledge would never be forgotten and that those who abused the power of plants would pay the price. The worst part was in the final paragraph of the letter. The writer admitted that after Mercy's death, they'd discovered the real cause of the plague: contaminated water from an upstream mining operation. Mercy had been innocent all along. She died for trying to save people from a disease she didn't cause. No wonder her spirit was angry. No wonder she didn't trust outsiders who came to study her plants. But knowing the truth didn't make her any less dangerous. If anything, she was getting worse. The number of incidents near Whispering Creek was increasing, and people were starting to talk about closing the entire wilderness area. I had to do something, but every time I tried to approach the creek, every time I tried to communicate with her, the attacks on visitors got more severe. It was like she saw me as the worst kind of traitor, someone who understood plants but worked for the same kind of people who'd killed her. That's when I realized I had to face her directly. I had to go back to that garden, back to the place where she died, and try to make her understand that not all outsiders were her enemies. I had to convince a 300-year-old ghost to trust me. Or I had to find a way to stop her before she killed someone else. I went back to Whispering Creek on a moonless night in late July. I figured if I was going to confront a witch's ghost, I might as well do it when her power would be strongest. This time, I didn't bring any equipment except a backpack full of things I thought she might recognize. Traditional healing herbs, some old books about folk medicine, and a hand-carved wooden bowl that had belonged to my grandmother. The garden appeared the moment I entered the valley. One step, the forest was normal. The next step, I was standing at the edge of the circular clearing I'd seen before. But now it looked different, older somehow, more established. The plants were bigger and more varied, and I could see paths worn between the different sections. In the center of the garden, tending a patch of herbs I didn't recognize, was Mercy Blackwood. She looked exactly like I'd imagined from the old descriptions. A young woman with long dark hair, wearing a simple brown dress that might have been fashionable in the 1740s. But her skin was pale as moonlight, and when she turned to look at me, I could see the burn scars covering half her face. "You," she said, and her voice was the same whisper I'd been hearing for weeks. "You keep coming back." "My name is Margaret," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I want to help you." She laughed, that same glass-breaking sound that hurt my ears. "Help me? You work for them. You guide their scientists, their researchers. You help them steal my knowledge so they can profit from it." "That's not true," I said. "I'm trying to preserve the old knowledge, not exploit it." "Lies." She stood up, and I could see that her hands were blackened and twisted, like they'd been burned over and over again. "I've seen how they work. They come with their machines and their chemicals, trying to break down my plants into pieces they can understand. They don't respect the knowledge. They don't honor the traditions." I took a step closer and immediately felt the temperature drop. My breath came out in visible puffs, even though it was a warm summer night. "You're right about some of them," I admitted, "but not about all of us. I've spent 15 years learning from people like you, people who understood plants before there were laboratories and test tubes." She tilted her head, studying me. "Show me." Without thinking, I reached into my backpack and pulled out a bunch of willow bark I'd harvested that morning. "For pain," I said, holding it out to her. "The old way, like you would have done it." For a moment, her expression softened. But then her burned face twisted with rage. "You mock me," she hissed. "You think I'm some simple herb woman content to ease headaches and stomach troubles? I am more than that now. I am death and healing combined. I am the power to give life or take it away." The plants around us began to move, their stems lengthening, their leaves turning from green to black. Vines erupted from the ground, reaching for my ankles. "This is what they taught me," she continued, raising her ruined hands. "When they burned me for trying to heal, they showed me that healing and hurting are the same power. Now I give people exactly what they deserve." I jumped back as thorny vines grabbed for my legs. "The people you're hurting aren't the ones who killed you. They're innocent hikers, families with children." "Innocent?" Her voice rose to a shriek. "They come here to take from my land, to steal my plants, to use my knowledge for their own gain, just like the ones who came before." Nothing changes. The vines were everywhere now, growing impossibly fast, covered with thorns that dripped something that looked like black blood. I could smell poison in the air, bitter almonds and rotting flowers, but I didn't run. Instead, I did something that probably saved my life. I sat down, right there in the middle of her garden, surrounded by poisonous vines and deadly herbs. I sat cross-legged on the ground and started sorting through the plants in my backpack. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Learning," I said, pulling out my grandmother's wooden bowl. You said you'd teach me, so teach me. I started grinding willow bark in the bowl, using a smooth stone the way my grandmother had taught me when I was a child. The familiar motions were calming, and they seemed to calm Mercy too. The vines stopped reaching for me, though they didn't retreat. Why? She asked. Why do you want to learn the old ways when you could use your modern machines? Because machines don't understand, I said, continuing to grind the bark. They can tell you what chemicals are in a plant, but they can't tell you how to use it. They can't tell you when to harvest it, or how to prepare it, or which plants work together. That knowledge is dying, and when it's gone forever. She was quiet for a long time, watching me work. Slowly, the poison smell in the air began to fade. You really want to preserve the knowledge? She asked finally. Yes. But not your way. Not by hurting people who don't understand. Then how? Her voice was softer now, less angry, more tired. How do I make them understand that plants are not just things to be taken and used? How do I make them respect the knowledge? I looked up at her, this woman who died trying to save people from a disease she didn't understand. By teaching them. By sharing what you know, not by punishing them for what they don't know. For the first time since I'd met her, Mercy Blackwood smiled. It was a sad smile, but genuine. I tried to teach them once, she said. They burned me for it. Times have changed, I said. People are more willing to listen now. Especially to someone who knows as much as you do. She looked around at her garden, at the impossible plants growing in perfect harmony. I have been angry for so long. The anger made me strong, but it also made me what I am now. Something between healing and harm. You can choose to be something different, I said. You can choose to heal again. She knelt down across from me, her ghostly form flickering in the moonlight. If I do this, if I stop the anger, stop the punishment, I will lose my power. I will fade away, and my knowledge will fade with me. No, I said firmly. I'll make sure your knowledge survives. I'll write it down, teach it to others, make sure it's preserved the right way. Your real knowledge, not just the anger. She reached out with one burned hand, almost touching the willow bark powder I'd been grinding. You would do that? Even after what I've done? Yes. For a long moment, we sat there in silence. Then Mercy Blackwood began to teach me things about plants that I'd never imagined possible. She taught me how to see the connections between different species, how to understand which combinations would heal and which would harm. She showed me plants that existed only in her garden, hybrids she'd created through centuries of careful cultivation. Most importantly, she taught me that healing was about more than just the plants themselves. It was about understanding the person who needed healing, understanding what they truly required, not just what their symptoms suggested. As dawn broke over the mountains, Mercy began to fade. But before she disappeared completely, she made me a promise. The dangerous plants will grow normal again, she said. The valley will be safe, but the garden will remain for those who truly seek to learn. Those who come with respect and genuine desire for knowledge will find it. Others will see only ordinary forest. Will I see you again? I asked. She smiled one last time. When you need guidance, when you have questions about the old ways, sit by the creek and listen. I may not appear, but my knowledge will remain. And then she was gone. The first thing I did was check on the hikers who'd been hurt by the poisonous plants. Within days, their symptoms started improving. The little girl's scars faded to barely visible marks. The elderly man's digestive problems cleared up completely. Dr. Chen's burns healed too, though she kept the bandages on for weeks because she couldn't believe the damage had really disappeared. I wrote a detailed report for the Park Service, though I left out most of the supernatural elements. I focused on the unusual plant growth patterns and the apparent contamination that had caused the mysterious illnesses. I recommended that the area be designated as a special botanical preserve, with restrictions on who could access it and what kind of research could be conducted there. The recommendation was approved. Whispering Creek Valley is now officially protected as a site of unique ecological significance. But the real work began after that. I started visiting the garden regularly, always alone, and always with respect. Mercy kept her promise. The garden appears whenever I need to learn something new, whenever I have questions about the traditional uses of plants. I've been documenting everything I learn, writing it all down in a series of journals that I hope will someday be published. Not as folklore or superstition, but as genuine botanical knowledge that deserves to be preserved. I've also been reaching out to other people who study traditional plant knowledge, ethnobotanists, herbalists, indigenous healers who still practice the old ways. Many of them have their own stories about places where the plants seem to have memory, where the knowledge of the ancestors still lingers. There are other sites, other spirits like Mercy, throughout Appalachian healing sites. Most of them are benevolent, but some have been corrupted by anger and injustice, just like she was. I'm working on a project to document these places, to help people understand and respect the knowledge they contain. The hardest part is knowing that I can't tell the full truth about what happened at Whispering Creek. If I wrote about seeing Mercy's ghost, about her teaching me botany that goes beyond what any university could offer, people would think I was crazy. So I stick to the facts that can be verified. The unusual plant combinations, the healing properties of certain herbs, the traditional knowledge that's being lost as the old practitioners die. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in the mountains, I wonder what other knowledge is out there waiting to be found. How many other spirits are guarding secrets that could help people? How many traditional healers were killed or silenced before they could pass on what they knew? Mercy once told me that plants have long memories. They remember who helped them grow and who destroyed them. They remember which humans treated them with respect and which saw them only as resources to be exploited. I think she was right, and I think there are places all over the world where that memory is still alive, where the knowledge of the ancestors still exists for those willing to approach it with humility and respect. The Witch of Whispering Creek isn't a monster anymore. She's a teacher, a guardian of knowledge that the world desperately needs. But she's also a warning about what happens when we lose respect for the wisdom of the past. I still visit her garden every few weeks. Sometimes I see her, usually just a glimpse out of the corner of my eye as she tends her impossible plants. Sometimes I just feel her presence, approving or correcting as I practice the techniques she's taught me. The valley is safe now for ordinary visitors. But for those who come seeking real knowledge, who approach the plants and the land with genuine respect and desire to learn, Whispering Creek still holds its secrets. You just have to know how to listen. My name is Thomas Blackwood, and I've been a ranger in the Chattahoochee National Forest for 24 years. I've tracked bears, relocated mountain lions, and dealt with every dangerous animal Georgia has to offer. I thought I knew these mountains better than anyone alive. I was wrong. It started in October 1991, right when hunting season opened up around Brasstown Bald. That's Georgia's highest peak, covered in thick hardwood forest and granite rocks that jut out like broken teeth. Most folks don't venture up there much. The trails are tough, and the forest is so dense you can lose your way even with a compass. I was 47 then, old enough to know the difference between animal behavior and something else entirely. Used to be a big game hunter myself before I got into conservation work. Killed my share of bears and deer until I realized I liked watching them live more than watching them die. The first call came in on a Tuesday morning. 3 hunters from Atlanta reported something they called the biggest damn bear we ever seen. They were shaking when they came into the ranger station, still covered in mud and sweat from running down the mountain. Ranger Blackwood, the oldest one, said, his hands trembling as he poured coffee. That thing wasn't natural. It walked on 2 legs like a man, then dropped down and ran on all 4s faster than any animal has a right to. I've heard tall tales from hunters before. Fear and adrenaline make everything look bigger and scarier than it really is. But these men weren't bragging or trying to impress anyone. They were genuinely terrified. How big are we talking? I asked, pulling out my incident report forms. 12 feet tall when it stood up, the youngest hunter whispered. Maybe more. And the sound it made. He shuddered. Never heard anything like it, like a bear roaring and a man screaming at the same time. I figured it was probably just a large black bear. We get some big ones in Georgia, especially the old males. Standing on their hind legs, they can look pretty impressive to someone who's never seen it before. But something about the way these men looked at each other made me pay attention. That afternoon, I hiked up to where they'd been camping. The site was about 3 miles up the Brasstown Bald Trail, in a clearing surrounded by oak and hickory trees. What I found there made me stop cold. The tracks were real. Bear tracks, definitely, but like nothing I'd ever seen in 2 decades of wildlife management. Each paw print was the size of a dinner plate, with claw marks that dug 4 inches into the hard-packed earth. I've tracked hundreds of bears, and even the biggest ones don't leave marks like these. But it was the pattern that really got my attention. The tracks went from 4-footed to 2-footed and back again, like the animal couldn't decide how it wanted to walk. I followed them for about 50 yards until they disappeared into a rocky area where tracking became impossible. On my way back to the station, I stopped by the old Cherokee Cultural Center in town. My grandmother was Cherokee, and she'd taught me to respect the old stories, even if I didn't always believe them. I asked Mary Crowfeather, who ran the place, about any legends connected to Brasstown Bald. Kekle Kudle, she said immediately, her face growing serious. The Great Bear Guardian. Our ancestors said it protected the sacred places on the mountain from those who would harm them. Just stories, right? I asked. Mary looked at me for a long moment. Stories have a way of becoming real when people forget why they were told in the first place. I drove home that night thinking about dinner plate-sized tracks and hunters who ran for their lives. 24 years in these woods, and I'd never seen anything I couldn't explain. But as I pulled into my driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed in the forest I thought I knew so well. The second incident happened 3 days later. This time it was a family of hikers. Mom, Dad, and 2 teenage kids from Dahlonega. They came stumbling into town just after sunset, clothes torn and faces pale with terror. "It followed us," the father kept saying. "For miles, it followed us." I met them at the local clinic where they'd gone to get scratches cleaned up. Nothing serious, just cuts from running through thick brush. But they were all in shock. "Tell me exactly what happened," I said, sitting down across from the family in the waiting room. The mother spoke first. "We were hiking the Appalachian Trail section that goes near the peak. Around noon, all the birds just stopped singing. Everything went quiet. Even our footsteps seemed too loud. That's when we saw the trees," the teenage daughter added. "Someone or something had clawed marks into them, high up, like 15 feet off the ground." The father nodded. "Deep gouges in the bark, all the way around the trunk. Fresh ones, too." Sap was still running out. I knew those trees, old oaks that had been growing on that mountainside for over a century. Whatever marked them had to be incredibly strong and tall. No bear in Georgia could reach that high, not even standing on its hind legs. "Did you see what made the marks?" I asked. "We heard it first," the son said quietly. "This roar, but wrong somehow, like it was trying to talk but didn't know how." The family looked at each other, and I could see they were all remembering the same thing. "It was watching us from the ridge above the trail," the mother continued. "We could see its shape between the trees, huge, dark, moving wrong, sometimes on 4 legs, sometimes on 2. Then it started following us," the father said, "staying parallel to the trail, matching our pace. Every time we stopped, it stopped. When we sped up, it sped up." The teenage girl started crying. "It played with us, Mr. Ranger, like a cat with mice. It could have caught us any time it wanted." I believed them. These weren't thrill seekers or attention seekers. They were just a normal family who'd encountered something that didn't belong in any nature guidebook. The next morning, I called my partner Williams, and we hiked up to investigate. Williams had been with the Park Service longer than me, and he'd seen everything these mountains had to offer, or so we thought. We found the claw marks exactly where the family described them. Deep gouges in the oak bark, running in perfect parallel lines from about 8 feet up to 15 feet high. The cuts were fresh, less than a day old, and they went all the way through to the white wood underneath. "Bear?" Williams asked, though his voice said he already knew the answer. "No bear did this," I said, running my fingers along the marks. "Wrong height, wrong pattern. And look at the spacing between the claws. The gouges were spaced wider apart than any bear paw I'd ever measured. Whatever made these marks had claws the size of railroad spikes and the reach of something much larger than any animal supposed to live in Georgia." We followed the trail the family had taken, looking for more signs. About half a mile down the path, we found something that made us both stop and stare. In a small clearing, someone or something had arranged animal bones in a perfect circle. Deer bones mostly, but also smaller animals, squirrels, rabbits, birds. They were old bones, bleached white by weather, but they'd been placed there recently. The grass underneath was still green. "Animals don't do this," Williams said quietly. "Neither do people," I replied. "Not normal people anyway." At the center of the bone circle sat a single black bear skull, much larger than any I'd seen before. When I knelt down to examine it, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The skull showed signs of tool marks, precise cuts that suggested it had been deliberately modified or prepared. That's when we heard the roar. It came from somewhere up the mountain, echoing off the granite rocks and rolling through the trees like thunder. But Williams was right. It wasn't entirely animal. There was something almost human in the sound, like words trying to form in a throat not made for speech. The forest went dead silent afterward. No birds, no insects, no rustling leaves. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "We should go," Williams said. I wanted to agree, but something made me stay. Maybe it was professional curiosity, or maybe it was the same stubborn streak that had made me a good tracker all these years. I wanted to understand what we were dealing with. 5 more minutes, I said. Let's check that ridge where the family saw movement. We climbed up through the oak trees to a rocky outcrop that overlooked the trail below. The view was perfect. You could see everything that moved on the path for half a mile in either direction. That's where we found the watching place. The grass was flattened in a rough oval, about the size and shape of something large lying down for hours. Scattered around the area were more bones, these ones clearly gnawed on and broken open for marrow, but it was the other things we found that really scared us. Personal items from hikers, a lens cap from a camera, a child's hair ribbon, a pocket knife with initials carved in the handle, all arranged in neat little piles, like trophies or warnings. "How long has this been watching people?" Williams whispered. I didn't have an answer. But as we prepared to leave, I noticed movement in the tree line about 100 yards away. Something large and dark shifted between the trunks, there for just a moment before disappearing deeper into the forest. It knew we were there, and it was letting us know that it knew. The killings started a week later. The first body belonged to Jake Morrison, a local hunter who'd been coming to these mountains every October for 15 years. They found him near Woody Gap, about 2 miles from where we discovered the bone circle. At least, they found most of him. I got the call at home around dawn. Sheriff's Department wanted a park ranger on scene to help determine if an animal was involved. I drove up there expecting to find a bear mauling, or maybe a freak accident with a tree falling. What I found was something else entirely. Jake's body was positioned against a large oak tree, sitting upright like he was resting. But the damage done to him was impossible. His rifle lay nearby, unfired. His hunting pack was neatly arranged beside him, contents undisturbed. Even his thermos of coffee was still warm. But his chest had been opened with surgical precision. 3 parallel cuts, each about 8 inches long, running from his collarbone to his stomach. The cuts were too clean for claws, too purposeful for any animal attack I'd ever seen. "What kind of bear does this?" Sheriff Donovan asked me. "None," I said honestly. "This wasn't random predation. This was deliberate." The State Wildlife Department sent up a specialist to examine the scene. Dr. Sarah Chen had investigated animal attacks all over the southeast, and she was as puzzled as the rest of us. "The positioning is ritualistic," she told me privately. "Whatever did this wanted the body to be found exactly like this. The wounds are post-mortem. He was already dead when they were made. What killed him then?" She pointed to Jake's neck. "Massive trauma to the cervical vertebrae. Something twisted his head completely around, instantly." The second victim was found 3 days later. Margaret Foster, a wildlife photographer who'd been documenting autumn colors near the peak. This time, the scene was even more disturbing. Margaret had been lifted into a tree, placed about 20 feet up in the fork between 2 main branches. Her expensive camera equipment was arranged on the ground below in a perfect circle, each piece carefully positioned. The camera itself was still running, its memory card full of photos. Williams and I reviewed the pictures while the body was being recovered. The first dozen shots showed normal forest scenes, leaves changing color, a few distant deer, the kind of nature photography Margaret was known for. Then the photos started getting strange. In shot 15, there was a shadow between the trees that didn't match any natural formation. Shot 16 showed the same shadow, but closer. By shot 20, you could clearly see something large moving through the forest, just at the edge of the frame. Shot 25 was the last clear photo. It showed Margaret's face, terror frozen in her expression, as she looked up at something above the camera's view. After that, the photos became chaotic. blurred images of sky and branches as the camera was apparently knocked from her hands. But it was the final photo that made us all go quiet. The camera had continued shooting as it fell, and the last image showed something looking down from the trees above. Not clearly, just a glimpse of yellow eyes and dark fur, but enough to know that whatever killed Margaret had been watching from above while she worked. "It's hunting us," William said that night as we sat in the ranger station, going over reports. "Animals don't hunt for sport," I replied. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Some animals do hunt for sport, but this felt different. More personal. The third killing happened right outside town. Bobby Clearwater was a local mechanic who also guided hunting parties in his spare time. He'd grown up in these mountains and knew them as well as anyone. On October 28th, he volunteered to lead a search party looking for whatever was killing people up on the mountain. We found him the next morning in his own backyard, 50 yards from his house. His wife had heard him go out around midnight to investigate a noise in their shed. She found him at dawn, sitting in their garden like he was admiring her tomato plants. This time, the killer had left a message. Bobby's hunting medals and patches had been removed from his jacket and arranged in a line leading from his body to the forest edge. At the end of the line, scratched deep into the dirt, were symbols that looked almost like writing. The state archaeologist who came to examine them said they resembled Cherokee petroglyphs, but he couldn't translate their meaning. "It's escalating," Dr. Chen told the emergency meeting that afternoon. 3 victims in 10 days, each showing increased ritual behavior. "Whatever we're dealing with, it's becoming bolder." "What do you recommend?" Sheriff Donovan asked. "Close the mountain," she said immediately. "No hiking, no hunting, no camping. Nothing until we figure out what's up there." That's when I made the biggest mistake of my career. "Give me 48 hours, I said. "Me and Williams know these mountains better than anyone. Let us track this thing and see if we can find its lair. If we can locate where it's hiding, you can bring in specialists to deal with it." Dr. Chen shook her head. "Ranger Blackwood, this isn't a normal predator. Normal tracking methods won't work." But I was stubborn and proud, and I thought 24 years in the forest meant something. I thought I could handle whatever was up there, just like I'd handled every other dangerous situation in my career. I should have listened to Dr. Chen. Instead, Williams and I loaded our packs with enough supplies for 2 days and headed up the mountain the next morning, armed with tranquilizer guns and radio equipment. We were going to find whatever was killing people on my mountain, and we were going to stop it. We had no idea that it was already tracking us. The forest felt wrong from the moment we entered it. Too quiet, like the whole mountain was holding its breath. Our footsteps seemed to echo even on soft ground, and every shadow looked like it might be hiding something large and hostile. Around noon, we found the cave system. It was hidden in a granite outcrop about half a mile from the peak, concealed behind fallen rocks and thick mountain laurel. We might have missed it completely if Williams hadn't noticed the smell. "Something died in there," he said, covering his nose with his sleeve. The entrance was barely wide enough for a person, but it opened into a much larger chamber inside. When we turned on our flashlights, what we saw made us both take a step backward. Bones. Hundreds of them, arranged in careful patterns along the cave walls. Human and animal bones mixed together, some old and weathered, others fresh enough that they still had tissue attached. At the center of the cave floor was a flat stone that looked like an altar, stained dark with what could only be dried blood. "We need to call this in," Williams whispered. But before either of us could reach for our radios, we heard movement deeper in the cave system. Something large was coming toward us through the darkness, breathing heavily and making a low rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the rock itself. We ran. Professional dignity and 24 years of experience went right out the window, and we ran like scared children, stumbling and crashing through the forest toward the trail. Behind us, something roared in fury and gave chase. We almost made it. Williams was ahead of me on the trail, moving faster than I'd seen him move in years. Behind us, trees were breaking as something massive crashed through the forest, gaining ground with every step. I could hear its breathing, deep and ragged, and that strange, almost human roar that raised every hair on my neck. "The truck!" Williams shouted, pointing toward where we'd parked at the trailhead. 50 yards. We just needed 50 more yards and we'd be safe in the vehicle, racing back to town to bring help. 40 yards. 30. I could see our Park Service truck sitting in the small gravel lot, looking like salvation. That's when something hit Williams from the side. I didn't see it clearly, just a dark shape moving faster than anything that big had a right to move. Williams went flying into a tree with a sound I'll never forget, and then he was lying on the ground, not moving. I spun around with my tranquilizer gun raised, but what I saw made me freeze completely. It stood 12 feet tall on its hind legs, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb the afternoon light. Its face was wrong, too intelligent for a bear, too savage for a human. Yellow eyes that held a cold, ancient anger stared down at me with the kind of hatred that goes back generations. But it wasn't the size or the eyes that paralyzed me. It was the intelligence I saw there. This thing was thinking, calculating, judging me. It knew exactly what it was doing and why. The creature dropped to all fours and began circling me, moving with the fluid grace of something that had been hunting for far longer than any normal animal should live. When it opened its mouth, the sound that came out was that impossible roar voice I'd heard before. But this time, I could almost understand it. Kekle Kudle, it seemed to say. Kekle Kudle. The Cherokee name Mary Crowfeather had told me about, the great bear guardian. As the realization hit me, memories of my grandmother's stories came flooding back. Tales she'd told when I was young about the spirits that protected sacred places, awakened only when those places were threatened or desecrated. "You're protecting something," I whispered, not caring if the creature could understand me or not. "Someone's been hurting your mountain." The bear thing stopped circling and stared at me with those terrible yellow eyes. For a moment, the anger in them seemed to soften slightly, replaced by something that might have been curiosity. Then Williams groaned from where he lay against the tree, and the creature's attention snapped back to him. I saw murder in its gaze. "Wait," I said, stepping between the guardian and my partner. "He doesn't know." Neither of us knew. The thing looked back at me, and I swear it tilted its head like it was listening. "The cave," I continued, pieces falling into place in my mind. "That's a sacred site, isn't it? Someone's been dumping things there, polluting it. That's why you're killing people." Over the past few months, we'd had reports of illegal dumping in the forest. Chemical waste from a plant closure in North Georgia. Toxic materials that some company was secretly disposing of in remote areas where they thought no one would find it. We'd been trying to track down the source, but the mountain was huge, and the dumpers were careful. The guardian made that almost voice sound again, but quieter this time, sadder. "Show me," I said. "Show me what they've done." For a long moment, the creature and I stared at each other. I could feel it weighing my words, deciding whether I was another threat to be eliminated or something else entirely. Finally, it turned and began walking back toward the cave, pausing to look over its shoulder at me. I followed, leaving Williams unconscious but alive by the trail. I had no choice. This thing could have killed us both easily, but it was giving me a chance to understand, maybe to help. The cave system was much larger than Williams, and I had realized. The bone chamber was just the entrance to a network of passages that went deep into the mountain. The guardian led me through tunnels that opened into massive underground rooms, their walls covered with ancient Cherokee symbols and paintings. At the heart of the cave system was the sacred space that had been violated. Dozens of chemical drums and waste containers had been dumped in a natural cathedral-like chamber, their contents leaking into the stone and poisoning the underground streams. The smell was toxic and choking. Some of the containers were recent, others had been there for months, slowly contaminating everything the Cherokee had held sacred. The guardian stood at the edge of the desecration and made a sound of pure grief. In that moment, I understood everything. This wasn't a monster killing for sport or territory. This was a spiritual guardian, driven to desperate violence by the destruction of something it was sworn to protect. "I'm sorry," I said to the creature. "I'm so sorry we let this happen." It looked at me with those ancient eyes, and I saw something I hadn't expected to see. Hope. "I'll fix this," I promised. "I'll bring people who can clean this up and arrest whoever did it. But you have to stop killing. There are good people on this mountain too. People who respect it like you do." The guardian studied me for what felt like hours. Then it did something that nearly made me faint. It reached out with one massive paw and gently touched my shoulder, careful not to let its claws break my skin. The touch burned like ice and fire at the same time, but with it came understanding. Images flashed through my mind, the mountain as it had been centuries ago, the Cherokee ceremonies that had taken place in this cave, the sacred springs that were now poisoned, the animals that were dying from drinking contaminated water, but also the promise of restoration, the Guardian showing me where every dump site was hidden, how to track the people responsible, what needed to be done to heal the mountain. When the visions ended, I was on my knees in the cave, and the Guardian was gone. I made my way back to Williams, who was awake but badly shaken. Together, we hiked down to our truck and drove straight to town. The cleanup took 6 months. Using the information the Guardian had somehow shared with me, federal investigators tracked the illegal dumping to a chemical company in Atlanta. The CEO and 3 managers were arrested and sentenced to prison. The company was fined millions of dollars, money that went directly toward environmental restoration. I led the cleanup teams personally, working with Cherokee environmental specialists and EPA experts to remove every trace of contamination from the cave system. We restored the sacred chamber to something approaching its original condition and installed monitoring systems to prevent future dumping. The killings stopped the day after my encounter in the cave. Williams and I never reported exactly what we'd seen down there, just that we'd discovered the illegal dumping and tracked it to its source. The official report blamed the deaths on a large, aggressive bear that had been driven to unusual behavior by chemical poisoning. Williams transferred to a different forest a month later. He never talked about what happened on the mountain, but sometimes I catch him looking at pictures of the area with an expression I recognize. The look of someone who's seen something that changed how they view the world. I stayed. Someone had to watch over the restoration work, and besides, I'd made a promise. These days, Brasstown Bald is peaceful again. The wildlife has returned. Birds singing, deer grazing, bears acting like normal bears. Hikers and campers come through regularly without incident. Most people who visit never know how close we came to losing this place forever. But sometimes, especially in October when the leaves are changing, I hike up to the cave system to check on things. The Cherokee Nation has officially reclaimed the site, and they hold ceremonies there now to bless the restored spaces. I've never seen the Guardian again, but I know it's still there. Sometimes I find offerings left at the cave entrance. Flowers, sage bundles, small carved figures that weren't there the day before. And occasionally, hikers report glimpses of something large moving through the trees on the upper slopes, watching them but never threatening. The mountain has its protector back, and the protector has learned that not all humans are enemies of the land. I'm 59 years old now, and I'll be retiring in a few years. When I do, I'll recommend that the cave system be officially designated as a Cherokee cultural site, permanently protected from any kind of development or exploitation. It's the least I can do for the Guardian that taught me the difference between managing land and truly caring for it. Mary Crowfeather tells me the Cherokee have new stories now, about the ranger who helped wake the old spirits and heal the wounded mountain. She says these stories will be told for generations, reminders that the ancient guardians are still there, still watching, still protecting the sacred places for those who remember why they matter. I don't know if that's true. But I do know that every time I walk through the forest around Brasstown Bald, I feel like I'm being watched over by something larger and older than myself. Something that judges not by words or intentions, but by actions and respect. The mountain remembers everything. And now, so do I. My name is Catherine Harlow, and I've been a park ranger for 19 years. Most people think my job is all campfire safety talks and helping lost hikers, but I spend my time protecting places where history happened. Civil War battlefields, old settlements, spots where people lived and died long before we got here. I know these Virginia mountains better than my own backyard. Every trail, every creek, every place where soldiers once marched through what's now the George Washington National Forest. I've walked Antietam at sunrise and stood in the bloody cornfields at Sharpsburg. I can tell you where Stonewall Jackson fell and show you trenches that still scar the earth after all these years. But there's one place that's different. One place that makes my skin crawl every time I have to go there. They call it Raven's Roost, though you won't find that name on any modern map. It's a small meadow, about 20 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by trees so old they were saplings during the war. You can only reach it by old logging roads that haven't seen a truck in decades. Most people don't even know it exists. That's probably for the best. I first heard about Raven's Roost from some metal detector enthusiasts back in October. They'd gotten permission to search for artifacts in the national forest, which happens sometimes. Usually they find old bottles, maybe a horseshoe if they're lucky. Civil War stuff is rare and protected anyway. But these guys were different. They came to my office white-faced and shaking, talking about finding fresh musket balls scattered across the meadow. Not buried treasure that had been in the ground for over a century, fresh lead balls that were still warm when they picked them up. "Ma'am," the older one said, his hands trembling as he lit his third cigarette in 10 minutes. There was gunpowder smoke in the air, strong enough to taste, but there wasn't any fire, no shooting happening anywhere near there. I thought they were playing some kind of joke on me. Metal detector guys love their stories, and they'll stretch the truth to make their finds sound more exciting. But when they showed me their equipment, expensive detectors that were giving off readings for metal that wasn't there, I knew something was wrong. Their machines kept beeping and pointing to empty spots in the grass. The readings were strong, like there were bullets and belt buckles and sword blades right under their feet. But when they dug, they found nothing but dirt and old roots. "You might want to check that place out yourself," the younger one said as they packed up their gear. "Something ain't right about that meadow." Ing squirmed. "I've spent my whole career dealing with facts. Historical records, archaeological evidence, things I can touch and measure and prove. My brother Danny always said I was too serious, too focused on dead things instead of living life. He died in Vietnam when I was 20, and maybe that's why I ended up caring so much about the boys who died in our own war, right here on American soil. I study every battle, every skirmish, every place where young men bled into Virginia dirt. I know their names, their units, their stories. The dead deserve to be remembered. But I never expected one of them to remember me back. I decided to check out Raven's Roost on November 15th, 1987. The date mattered more than I knew then. It was almost exactly 124 years since the battle that happened there. A small fight that didn't make it into the big history books. Just another day when boys with rifles shot each other over ground that looks peaceful now. The drive out there takes about an hour on roads that get narrower and rougher as you go. Ancient oak trees lean over the path like they're trying to block the way. The forest gets quieter the deeper you go, until even the birds stop singing. When I finally reached the meadow, I sat in my truck for a long time before getting out. The place looked innocent enough, just a circular clearing maybe 100 yards across, surrounded by trees that seemed too thick and too dark. There were some old stone formations scattered around, probably natural, and the grass was the kind of bright green you only see in places where the earth is rich with old rain and older blood. But something felt wrong. The air was too still, too heavy. My radio crackled with static even though I was getting clear reception just a mile back. And there was a smell in the air, not quite smoke, but something burned and metallic. I grabbed my camera and notepad and stepped into the meadow. That's when I heard the footsteps. The sound was faint at first, just a steady rhythm coming from somewhere in the trees. Left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. Like someone walking patrol, keeping time like soldiers do. I stopped and listened, my hand moving automatically to the radio on my belt. The footsteps kept going, circling the meadow just inside the tree line. Always the same pace, never stopping, never getting closer or farther away. "Hello?" I called out. "This is Ranger Harlow. Is someone out there?" The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it made my ears ring. No birds, no wind, no insects buzzing. Just me standing alone in a meadow that suddenly felt like the loneliest place on earth. Then the footsteps started again, but faster now. Still keeping that military rhythm, but urgent. Like whoever was walking had somewhere important to be. I followed the sound, pushing through the undergrowth, at the edge of the meadow. The Virginia woods in November are thick with dead leaves and fallen branches. Every step I took sounded like thunder. But somehow I couldn't catch up to those other footsteps. They stayed just ahead of me, just out of sight. After 10 minutes of crashing through the forest, I gave up and went back to the meadow. I had work to do, and I wasn't going to let some hiker or maybe a hunter scare me off. That's when I found the rope. It was hanging from a big oak tree at the far edge of the clearing. Old rope, the kind they used to make from hemp back in the 1800s. It was weathered and gray, but strong-looking, and it was tied in a perfect noose. I'd been to this meadow once before. About 5 years ago, doing a survey for the Park Service. I would have remembered a rope hanging from a tree. I remember everything about these places. It's my job. But there it was, swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. I took pictures of everything. The rope, the tree, the meadow from different angles. Then I got out my metal detector, a good one the Park Service issued me for archaeological work. I started sweeping the ground around the oak tree. Immediately, the detector went crazy, beeping and clicking like there was a treasure chest buried right under my feet. The readings showed metal objects at various depths, some shallow, some deep. Exactly what you'd expect at a Civil War battlefield site. But when I started digging, I found nothing. I dug 6 holes around that tree, each one 3 feet deep. The detector kept insisting there was metal right where I was digging, but all I found was dirt and rocks and a few old roots. By the time the sun started going down, I was frustrated and tired, and my hands were raw from digging. I packed up my gear and headed back to the truck, planning to come back with better equipment and maybe some help. That's when I heard the marching again. But this time, it wasn't just one person. It sounded like a whole group of men walking in formation, their boots hitting the ground in perfect time. The sound was coming from the meadow behind me, and it was getting louder. I turned around and saw them. At least, I thought I saw them. Just for a second, in the corner of my eye, shapes moving across the meadow in organized lines. Men in gray uniforms carrying rifles, but when I looked directly at the spot, there was nothing there. Just empty grass and the rope swaying from its tree. I got in my truck and drove away faster than I should have on those rough roads. But in my rearview mirror, I swear I could see campfires burning in the meadow and shadows moving around them. The next morning, I called my partner Jim Reynolds. Jim's been a ranger almost as long as I have, and he's the only person I know who takes the historical stuff as seriously as I do. He's also the most level-headed man I've ever met, which is why I needed to talk to him about what happened at Raven's Roost. "You want me to go out there with you?" he asked after I told him about the rope and the footsteps and the metal detector readings that led to nothing. "I want you to tell me I'm losing my mind," I said. "Catherine, you're the most practical person I know. If you say something's wrong out there, then something's wrong. When do we leave?" We drove out to Raven's Roost together that afternoon. I felt better having Jim with me, and I hoped his metal detector would give us different readings than mine had. Maybe my equipment was broken. Maybe there was a logical explanation for everything. But when we got to the meadow, the rope was gone. I took Jim to the exact tree where I'd seen it hanging. The oak was ancient and huge, with branches thick enough to support the weight of a man. But there was no rope, no marks on the bark where a rope might have been tied. "You sure this is the right tree?" Jim asked, running his hands over the trunk. "I'm sure." "Well, let's see what the detectors say." We spent 2 hours sweeping every inch of that meadow with our metal detectors. Both machines agreed there was metal everywhere under the grass. The readings were strong and consistent, showing objects at different depths across the entire clearing. But when we dug, we found nothing. "This doesn't make sense," Jim said, staring at his detector. The machine was beeping steadily, insisting there was a large metal object right where he stood. "The readings are perfect. Strong signal, good depth indication. There should be something here." That's when we heard the musket fire. It was a single shot, loud and sharp, coming from the trees on the north side of the meadow. The sound echoed across the clearing and faded into the hills beyond. Jim and I looked at each other. We both knew what a musket sounded like. We'd heard them fired at reenactments and historical demonstrations. This was the real thing. The deep boom of black powder igniting, the specific crack of a lead ball leaving a rifled barrel. "Hunting season?" Jim asked, but he didn't sound like he believed it. "Wrong caliber," I said, "and no one hunts with muskets anyway." We waited for another shot, but it didn't come. Just silence, and the smell of gunpowder drifting across the meadow on a wind that made the grass bend and wave like it was underwater. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the rope that had vanished and the metal that wasn't there, and the sound of gunfire from weapons that shouldn't exist. I also kept thinking about something I'd read in an old military record years ago. A small engagement at an unnamed meadow in November 1863. Confederate deserters executed for cowardice. Bodies buried without markers. The next morning, I went to the library and started digging through historical records. What I found made my hands shake. The records were buried in the state archives, mixed in with hundreds of other reports from the war. Just 3 pages of handwritten notes from a Union captain named Marcus Webb, dated November 16, 1863. The report described a small Confederate unit that had been cut off from the main army and trapped in a meadow surrounded by Union forces. Most of the rebels had fought bravely and died in the clearing, but one soldier, Private Thomas Garrett, had thrown down his weapon and tried to surrender. Captain Webb wrote that Garrett was captured alive and held for questioning. But during the night, he tried to escape. He was caught by his own Confederate sergeant, who accused him of cowardice and desertion. The sergeant held a field court-martial right there in the meadow. 3 Confederate soldiers served as judges. They found Garrett guilty and sentenced him to death by hanging. They used a rope they found in a Union supply wagon, strung it from the biggest oak tree in the meadow. Garrett kept saying he wasn't a coward, that he'd only thrown down his weapon because it was jammed and he couldn't fire. But nobody listened. The execution happened at dawn on November 17, 1863. Garrett was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the meadow. The sergeant and the other Confederate soldiers were killed by Union forces later that same day. Captain Webb noted that they searched Garrett's musket after the execution and found he was telling the truth. The weapon was jammed with a double-loaded charge that would have exploded in his face if he'd tried to fire. Thomas Garrett died for a cowardice he didn't commit, killed by his own men for trying to save his own life from a defective weapon. I made copies of everything and drove straight back to Raven's Roost. This time, I brought camping gear. I was going to spend the night in that meadow and find out what was really happening there. I set up my tent at the south edge of the clearing, as far from the hanging tree as I could get. The afternoon was quiet and normal. I ate dinner, watching the sun go down through the trees, and for a while I almost convinced myself that I was just camping in a peaceful forest clearing. Then the sun disappeared and the real activity began. It started with the sound of men talking in low voices. Not close enough to make out words, but definitely human voices having conversations. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the sounds, but they seemed to move away as I approached, always staying just out of range. Then came the campfires. I saw them flickering through the trees around the meadow, small fires scattered through the forest, maybe a dozen of them. Orange light dancing against tree trunks, shadows moving around the flames. I could smell wood smoke and something cooking. But when I shined my flashlight toward the fires, there was nothing there. Just dark trees and empty forest. The voices got louder as the night went on. I started to make out individual words: ammunition, advance, hold the line. Military commands and responses, like soldiers preparing for battle. Around midnight, I saw the first clear figure. He was standing at the edge of the meadow, maybe 50 yards from my tent. A young man in a gray Confederate uniform that was torn and dirty. He had dark hair and a thin face, and there was something wrong with his neck, a dark line around his throat like a rope burn. He was looking right at me. I pointed my flashlight at him, but the beam went right through him like he was made of fog. He didn't disappear, though. He just stood there, watching me with sad eyes that seemed to glow with their own light. Then he spoke. I heard his voice as clearly as if he was standing next to me. "Ma'am, I need you to know I wasn't a coward. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. This was impossible. But it was happening. I served with honor," the figure continued. "My musket was defective. I tried to tell them, but they wouldn't listen. They said I was lying to save myself from the rope." "Thomas Garrett?" I whispered. The ghost, because that's what he was, no point denying it anymore, nodded slowly. "I've been walking patrol here for 124 years, waiting for someone to believe me, waiting for someone to set the record straight. I found the military records," I said, surprised that my voice was working. "I know what really happened to you." For the first time since I'd seen him, Thomas Garrett smiled. "Then you'll help me?" "Help you do what?" "Prove my innocence. Show the world I wasn't a coward. Let me rest in peace instead of walking this cursed ground forever." Before I could answer, the sound of marching filled the meadow. But this time it wasn't just footsteps, it was a whole company of soldiers walking in formation, their equipment clanking and rattling as they moved. I turned to look, and the meadow was full of Confederate soldiers. They marched in neat lines across the grass, their gray uniforms pristine, their rifles gleaming in the moonlight. But they were all translucent, all glowing with that same pale light as Thomas Garrett, and every single one of them had rope burns around their necks. They're all deserters, Garrett said. All executed for cowardice, but most of them were innocent, just like me. We've been gathering here, waiting for justice. The ghost soldiers filled the entire meadow now, standing in formation like they were waiting for orders. There had to be at least 100 of them, all young men who died far from home and far from honor. What do you want from me? I asked. Official recognition, Garrett said. A record in the Park Service files that tells the truth about what happened here. These men deserve to be remembered as soldiers, not as cowards. And if I do that, you'll all move on, find peace? That's what we hope. I looked at the army of dead soldiers filling the meadow. They were all watching me now, waiting for my answer. Young faces, marked by tragedy and injustice. Boys who died believing they were failures when they were actually heroes. I'll need more evidence, I said, more than just one Union captain's report. Then we'll help you find it, Garrett said. That's when things went from supernatural to terrifying. The ghost soldiers suddenly started moving, not in formation, but frantically, like they were fighting an invisible enemy. They scattered across the meadow, some dropping to the ground, others raising their rifles to fire at targets I couldn't see. The peaceful scene turned into a battlefield. Musket fire erupted from all directions. The sound was deafening, like thunder rolling across the meadow without stopping. I could see muzzle flashes from dozens of rifles, but the bullets weren't real. They were made of the same pale light as the soldiers firing them. Men screamed and fell. Ghosts died again, reliving the battle that had killed them 124 years ago. The meadow filled with smoke and the smell of gunpowder and something worse, the metallic stench of blood. I ran for my tent, but when I looked back, the entire forest had changed. The trees were smaller, younger, like saplings. The meadow was scarred with trenches and earthworks. Dead horses lay scattered across the ground, and wagons burned at the edge of the clearing. I wasn't in 1987 anymore. I was in 1863, watching the battle that had damned these men to an eternity of seeking justice. The battle raged around me for what felt like hours. Ghost bullets whined through the air above my head. Dead men screamed orders and pleas, and final prayers. The meadow turned into a vision of hell that made my legs give out and my heart hammer against my ribs. But I wasn't really in danger. The ghost soldiers fought their phantom war around me, but they couldn't hurt me. I was a witness, not a participant. They needed me alive to tell their story. When the fighting finally stopped, the meadow was quiet again. Most of the ghost soldiers had faded away, but Thomas Garrett was still there. He looked more solid now, more real, like the battle had given him strength. Now you've seen it, he said. The truth of what happened here. That was just one battle, I said, getting shakily to my feet. What about your execution? What about the evidence I need to clear your name? Follow me. Follow me. Garrett led me to the big oak tree where I'd seen the rope hanging. But now there was more than just a tree. There was a whole scene playing out in ghostly light. I watched 3 Confederate soldiers sit in judgment of Private Thomas Garrett. I saw them tie the rope around his neck while he protested his innocence. I heard him explain about the jammed musket, saw him beg them to examine the weapon before they killed him. But the sergeant wouldn't listen. He was angry and scared and needed someone to blame for the disaster that had befallen his unit. Thomas Garrett was young and frightened and available, so he became the scapegoat for everyone's failures. Watch, Garrett said. See what they did after. The hanging was quick. Garrett's neck snapped cleanly, and his body went limp. The 3 Confederate soldiers cut him down and dragged him to a shallow grave they'd dug at the base of the tree. But then something interesting happened. The sergeant finally examined Garrett's musket. He found exactly what Garrett had said, a double-loaded charge jammed in the barrel. If Garrett had tried to fire, the weapon would have exploded and probably killed him. He'd thrown down his rifle not from cowardice, but from intelligence. The sergeant stared at the defective weapon for a long time. Then he threw it into Garrett's grave and covered it with dirt, burying the evidence of their mistake along with the innocent man they'd murdered. That musket is still there, Garrett said, buried with my bones at the base of this tree. Dig it up, and you'll have your proof. I looked at the big oak tree, trying to imagine digging up a grave that was more than a century old. I can't just start excavating on Park Service land. I'd need permits, archaeological oversight, official approval, then get them. That could take months. I've waited 124 years, Garrett said. I can wait a little longer. But as he spoke, I noticed something changing in the air around us. The other ghost soldiers were coming back, emerging from the trees in small groups, and they looked different now, hungrier, more desperate. "What are they doing?" I asked. Garrett turned to look at his fellow spirits, and his face went pale. "They're losing patience. The battle tonight gave them strength, but it also reminded them of how long they've been trapped here." "What does that mean?" "It means they might not want to wait for official recognition anymore. They might try to find another way to get their story told." "What other way?" "By making you one of us." The ghost soldiers started walking toward us, and I could see the rope burns around their necks getting brighter, more vivid. Their eyes weren't sad anymore. They were angry, desperate, hungry for justice at any cost. "If you died here," Garrett said quietly, "you could help us from the other side. A park ranger who died mysteriously at a Civil War site would get attention. People would investigate. They might find the truth." "That's not going to happen," I said, backing away from the approaching spirits. "I don't think you have a choice anymore." The ghost soldiers formed a circle around me and Garrett. Some of them were carrying ropes, nooses, just like the one that had killed them. Others held phantom bayonets that gleamed with cold light. "Wait," I said, "there's another way." They stopped advancing, but the circle didn't break. "I'm not just a park ranger," I continued. "I'm a published historian. I've written articles about Civil War sites for historical journals. People trust my research." "So," one of the ghosts said, "so I can write about this place. About all of you. I can tell your stories in academic publications, get historians and archaeologists interested in this site. That might be faster than waiting for official excavation permits." The ghosts looked at each other, considering this. "But how will you prove we're telling the truth?" another one asked. "I'll start with what I can document," I said. "Historical records, military reports, anything that mentions this battle or your executions. Then I'll push for archaeological investigation of the site. Once we find that musket and Thomas's remains, we'll have physical proof. And if nobody believes you, then I'll keep trying until somebody does. That's what historians do. We tell the stories that need to be told, even when they're inconvenient or hard to believe." Thomas Garrett stepped forward. "She's right. This is a better way than making her join us. Dead historians don't publish articles." The other ghosts grumbled, but they lowered their ropes and weapons. "How long?" one of them asked. "Give me 6 months," I said. 6 months to get the research done and the excavation approved. If I can't make progress by then, we'll figure something else out." Garrett nodded. 6 months. "But Catherine," he looked at me with those glowing eyes. "Don't make promises you can't keep. These men have been disappointed before. I understand. And don't come back here alone until this is resolved. Some of my companions are losing their ability to tell right from wrong. They might not be as patient with you next time." The ghost soldiers started fading as the first light of dawn appeared through the trees. Soon only Garrett remained, and even he was becoming translucent. 6 months, he repeated. "Don't forget about us, Catherine. We've been forgotten too long already." Then he was gone, and I was alone in a quiet meadow with my camping gear and a story no one would believe. But I was going to make them believe it anyway. It took me exactly 5 months and 3 weeks. I started with the Union captain's report I'd found in the state archives, then worked backward and forward through military records from 1863. I found references to the battle at the unnamed meadow, casualty lists that included Thomas Garrett and the other executed soldiers, even supply manifests that mentioned the rope used for the hangings. I compiled everything into a research paper and submitted it to the Journal of American Military History. The editor was intrigued, but wanted more evidence before publication. That's when I called in favors from every archaeologist and historian I knew. It took weeks of phone calls and paperwork, but I finally got approval for a limited excavation at Raven's Roost. We found Thomas Garrett's remains on November 15th, 1988, exactly 1 year after my first supernatural encounter in the meadow. His skeleton was buried at the base of the oak tree, just where his ghost had said it would be. And there, clutched in his bony fingers, was the musket that proved his innocence. The weapon was exactly as he'd described, double-loaded with a charge that would have exploded if fired. Ballistics experts confirmed that attempting to discharge the rifle would have been fatal to the shooter. Thomas Garrett died not as a coward, but as a young man smart enough to recognize a defective weapon and brave enough to risk court-martial rather than certain death. My research paper was published 3 months later. It included archaeological evidence, historical documents, and a complete reconstruction of the events at Raven's Roost. The journal called it groundbreaking research into the forgotten casualties of military justice. More importantly, the Park Service officially recognized the site as a Civil War battlefield and memorial. They installed a bronze plaque at the edge of the meadow that reads, "In memory of Private Thomas Garrett and all soldiers wrongfully executed for cowardice, their honor is hereby restored." I haven't seen any ghosts at Raven's Roost since the excavation ended. The meadow is peaceful now, just a pretty clearing in the forest where wildflowers grow and birds sing. Sometimes hikers find it and ask me about the plaque, and I tell them the story of the young men who died seeking justice. But I know Thomas Garrett and his companions are still out there, in a way, not trapped in that meadow anymore, but moving on to wherever spirits go when their earthly business is finished. I like to think they found the peace they'd been seeking for so long. The experience changed how I do my job. I still protect historical sites and educate visitors about the past, but now I pay more attention to the stories that didn't make it into the history books. The soldiers who died in shame, the victims of injustice, the forgotten casualties of wars that ended long ago. Sometimes, late at night in other Civil War sites, I hear footsteps in the woods or catch glimpses of figures in old uniforms. I don't run anymore. I stop and listen, because I've learned that the dead sometimes have important things to say. And if they need an advocate among the living, they know where to find me. My name is Catherine Harlow, and I'm a park ranger who believes in justice even when it takes 124 years to achieve. Especially then. My name is Rebecca Moonshiner, and I've been a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains for 13 years. People always smile when they hear my last name. They think it's funny, like I made it up. But it's real. My family's been in these mountains since before Tennessee was even a state. We've always been here, watching over these hills and valleys. I work the remote sections of the park, the places where tourists don't go. The forgotten hollows and unmarked trails where cell phones don't work and the fog never really lifts. It's quiet work, mostly. I check on old cabins, mark dangerous trees, and sometimes help lost hikers find their way back to the main trails. In 13 years, I've never lost a child on my watch. That's something I'm proud of. Kids wander off all the time in the mountains. They see a pretty butterfly or hear water running, and before you know it, they're deep in the woods with no idea how to get back. But I always find them, always bring them home safe. Maybe that's because I know what it's like to lose a child. My daughter Emma died when she was 7. Leukemia. She loved these mountains as much as I do. Used to beg me to take her camping every weekend. She said the trees talked to her, told her secrets about the old days. I thought it was just her imagination. Now I'm not so sure. The area I patrol most is called Dead Man's Hollow. It's about 15 miles from the nearest road, deep in the old Cherokee territory. The Cherokee have stories about this place. They called it the home of the little people, spirits that could help you or hurt you, depending on their mood. Most of the other rangers think it's just folklore, mountain superstition. I used to think that too. The hollow is always cold, even in summer. Mist hangs in the air like smoke, and the trees grow so thick you can barely see the sky. There's an old mining camp there from the 1800s. Rusty equipment scattered around, rotting wooden structures that look like they might fall down if you breathe on them too hard. In 1878, there was an accident at the mine, a tunnel collapse. 12 children died that day. Kids who worked in the mine, some as young as 6 years old. Their bodies were never found. The mine was sealed up and abandoned. I've been to the memorial plaque they put up later. It's hidden in the rhododendron thickets, so covered with moss you can barely read the names anymore. Sometimes I clean it off, make sure those children aren't completely forgotten. Last month, a school group reported something strange. They were on a nature hike with their teacher, staying on the marked trail like they're supposed to. But 3 of the kids swore they saw other children in the trees. Pale kids wearing old-fashioned clothes, just standing there watching them. The teacher didn't see anything. She figured the kids were making it up, the way kids do. But when she told me about it, something cold ran down my spine. Because I've heard those same stories before. Hikers talking about children who shouldn't be there. children who disappear when you look directly at them. I started paying closer attention to Dead Man's Hollow after that, checking it more often, looking for signs. And that's when I found the footprints. Small prints in the mud near the old mine entrance. Bare feet, like kids had been running around without shoes. But here's the thing that made my skin crawl. The prints had no heel marks. Like whoever made them was walking on their tiptoes, or floating just above the ground. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe some kids from town had hiked in, maybe the heel marks had been washed away by rain. But deep down, I knew something was wrong in Dead Man's Hollow, something that had been waiting there for a very long time. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in October. A family camping near Cataract Falls had lost their 8-year-old son, Tommy Chen. He'd been playing near their campsite after breakfast, and when his parents turned around, he was gone. I drove to the campsite as fast as I could on the winding mountain roads. The parents were frantic. The mother was crying, and the father kept walking in circles, calling Tommy's name until his voice went hoarse. "He was right here," Mrs. Chen kept saying. "He was playing with his toy trucks right here in the dirt." I went inside the tent for 2 minutes to get sunscreen. 2 minutes. I'd seen this panic before. The terrible fear that grips parents when their child vanishes in the wilderness. The mountains are beautiful, but they're dangerous too. A child can fall into a creek, get lost in a maze of identical trees, or stumble into an old mine shaft. "When did you last see him?" I asked, getting out my notepad. "About an hour ago," Mr. Chen said. "We called and called, then drove to the ranger station when you weren't there." An hour. In these mountains, a child could be miles away in an hour, or worse. I organized a search party, called in 3 other rangers and a group of volunteers from the local hiking club. We spread out in different directions, calling Tommy's name, checking every fallen log and rocky outcrop where a scared kid might hide. I headed toward Dead Man's Hollow. Something pulled me that way, a feeling I couldn't shake. Maybe it was instinct from 13 years of finding lost children. Maybe it was something else. The trail to the hollow is barely a trail at all, more like a deer path that winds between massive trees and over slippery rocks. The air got colder as I hiked deeper into the mountains. The normal forest sounds, birds singing, squirrels chattering, faded away until all I could hear was my own breathing and the crunch of leaves under my boots. Then I heard something else. Children's voices. Singing. I stopped walking and listened hard. The voices were faint, like they were coming from far away or from underground. They were singing an old song, something I'd heard before, but couldn't quite place. Down, down, down in the mine, working in the dark and grime, never see the sunshine bright, never see the morning light. My blood went cold. That was a mining song from the 1800s. I'd heard it in the folk music collection at the park's visitor center. But who would be teaching it to children today? And what children would be singing it out here in the middle of nowhere? I followed the sound toward the old mine entrance. The voices got clearer as I got closer, and I realized there were multiple children singing. At least 4 or 5 different voices, maybe more. The mine entrance is just a dark hole in the hillside, blocked by rusty iron bars that were installed after the accident. A sign warns people to stay out. Dangerous gases, unstable structures, possible cave-ins. But as I got closer, I noticed something that made my heart skip. The lock on the iron gate was broken. Not rusted through, broken. The metal was shiny where something had snapped the chain, and there were more footprints in the dirt. The same small, bare footprints with no heel marks. They led right up to the mine entrance and disappeared into the darkness beyond the bars. I called Tommy's name into the mine shaft. My voice echoed off the rock walls, bouncing deeper and deeper underground. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then I heard giggling. Children laughing and whispering like they were playing hide and seek. I tried my radio, but there was no signal this deep in the hollow. I tried my cell phone, same thing. I was completely cut off from the outside world. The smart thing would have been to hike back, get help, return with proper equipment and backup. But what if Tommy was down there? What if he'd somehow squeezed through the bars and gotten lost in the mine tunnels? Every minute counted. I found a loose section of the iron grating and managed to squeeze through. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, showing me a tunnel that stretched into the mountain. The air smelled old and damp, like a basement that's been closed up for years. The tunnel was bigger than I expected. high enough to walk upright, wide enough for the old mine cars that used to carry coal out of the mountain. Railroad tracks still ran along the floor, though the wooden ties were rotting and the rails were orange with rust. I walked slowly, sweeping my flashlight back and forth, calling Tommy's name. The sound bounced off the walls in weird ways, creating echoes that almost sounded like voices calling back. That's when my flashlight started acting up. The beam got dimmer and dimmer, even though I'd put in fresh batteries that morning. By the time I was 50 feet into the tunnel, it was barely glowing. I shook it, smacked it against my palm. Nothing helped. The light kept fading until it was just a weak yellow glow that barely showed me 2 feet ahead. And in that dim light, I saw something that made me stop breathing. A child's jacket hanging on a rusty nail driven into the tunnel wall. A small red jacket with a cartoon dinosaur on the back. Tommy's jacket. The same one his mother had described. But the nail was 8 feet off the ground. No 8-year-old could have hung a jacket that high, even if he was jumping. As I stared at the jacket, I heard footsteps running deeper into the mine, small feet, moving fast, and children's laughter echoing from the darkness ahead. I grabbed Tommy's jacket and kept going deeper into the mine, even though every instinct told me to turn around and run. The tunnel branched off in different directions, creating a maze of passages that disappeared into black holes in the rock. My flashlight died completely, leaving me in total darkness. I fumbled for the backup light on my belt, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the switch. When I finally got it on, the beam was weak and flickering. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. There were children in the tunnel with me. I could see them at the edge of my light, pale figures in old-fashioned clothes, standing perfectly still in the shadows. When I turned the flashlight directly on them, they weren't there, but I could feel them watching me. "Tommy," I called. "Tommy, are you down here?" One of the figures stepped forward, just enough for me to get a better look. It was a boy, maybe 10 years old, wearing overalls and a cloth cap like miners used to wear. His face was smudged with coal dust, and his eyes reflected my flashlight beam like an animal's eyes. "He's with us now," the boy said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "He's safe with us." "Where is he?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to take him back to his parents." The boy tilted his head to one side, like he was confused. "Parents? We don't have parents anymore. We just have each other." More children appeared in the shadows. Girls in long dresses and aprons, boys in work clothes, all of them pale as moonlight and covered with coal dust. They looked like they'd stepped out of an old photograph from the 1800s. "You're the children from the mining accident," I whispered. A girl with pigtails nodded solemnly. "We've been waiting so long," she said. "It gets lonely down here. But now we have friends to play with." "Tommy's not dead," I said. "He can't stay here." "Neither were we," another boy said, "when the rocks fell. But we're here now. We're all here together." They started moving closer, surrounding me in the narrow tunnel. I backed away, but they matched my pace, staying just at the edge of my light. Their bare feet made no sound on the rocky ground. "We've been calling to the other children," the first boy explained. "The ones who come to visit our mountain. We get so lonely, and they seem so happy. We just want to be happy too." I thought about the school group that had seen children in the trees, about all the stories I'd heard over the years of kids glimpsing other kids where no kids should be. "How many?" I asked. "How many children have you taken?" "Not taken," the girl with pigtails said, sounding hurt. "We don't take anyone, we just invite them to stay and play. Some of them like it here, it's safe in the mine. Nothing bad can happen when you're already dead." My backup light started flickering worse, throwing crazy shadows on the tunnel walls. In the dancing light, the children looked like they were moving even when they stood still. "I need to find Tommy," I said. "I need to bring him home." "This is home now," the boy in overalls said. "Come see." They turned and walked deeper into the mine, and somehow I found myself following them. The tunnel opened up into a large chamber, and what I saw there nearly stopped my heart. It was like an underground playground. Old mining equipment had been arranged into games, rusty buckets set up for throwing stones, mine car wheels turned into spinning toys, and there were children everywhere, dozens of them, from different time periods. Some in 1800s clothes like the mining children, others in outfits from the early 1900s, the 1,950 seconds. Even the 1,000, 980 seconds. And there, sitting in a circle with a group of ghost children, was Tommy Chen. He was laughing at something one of the dead children had said, completely unaware that he was playing with spirits. "Tommy," I shouted, running toward him. He looked up and waved. "Hi, Miss Rebecca. Look, I made new friends. They know lots of cool games." The dead children moved protectively around Tommy, blocking my path. Up close, I could see that they weren't quite solid. Light passed through them like they were made of mist, but they were definitely there, definitely real. "He belongs with us now," the boy in overalls said. "He's not sad anymore. None of them are sad when they're with us." I looked around the chamber and realized what he meant. These weren't just the 12 children from the original mining accident. These were all the children who had gone missing in these mountains over the past century and more. Lost hikers, runaways, kids who wandered off and were never found. "You can't keep them," I said, but even as I said it, I wondered if I was wrong. The children looked happy. Content. Tommy was smiling more than I'd seen him smile since we found him. "We're not keeping anyone," the girl with pigtails said. "They choose to stay. It's better here. No one gets sick. No one grows old. No one gets hurt." She was right, in a way. Down here in the mine, Tommy would never have to worry about getting lost or hurt or scared. He'd have friends to play with forever. He'd never have to face the pain and disappointment that comes with growing up. For just a moment, I understood why the children stayed, why parents let them go. But then I thought about Mr. and Mrs. Chen, probably still searching the woods and calling Tommy's name. I thought about my own daughter Emma and how I would have given anything for more time with her, even if that time included pain. "I'm taking him home," I said. That's when the children's expressions changed. The playful, innocent looks disappeared, replaced by something cold and desperate. "No," the boy in overalls said, and his voice echoed strangely in the chamber. "No one leaves. No one ever leaves us alone again." The chamber began to shake. Dust and small rocks fell from the ceiling as the ghost children's emotions grew stronger. My flashlight went out completely, leaving us in total darkness. And in that darkness, I heard the sound of the mine starting to collapse. The rumbling got louder as rocks began falling from the ceiling. I grabbed Tommy's hand and pulled him toward what I hoped was the way out, but in the darkness, I couldn't tell which direction we'd come from. "The tunnel's this way," I shouted over the noise, but Tommy pulled back. "I don't want to go," he said. "My new friends will be sad if I leave." The ghost children were crying now, their voices mixing together into a wail that seemed to come from the rock itself. Their fear and loneliness hit me like a wave, so strong it nearly knocked me down. "Please don't take him," the girl with pigtails begged. "We've been alone for so long. We just want someone to play with." In the darkness, I felt small hands grabbing at my clothes, trying to pull me deeper into the mine. The dead children were desperate now, their need for companionship stronger than any living emotion I'd ever felt. "I know you're lonely," I said, trying to stay calm even as the mine shook around us. "I know what it's like to lose someone you love." The pulling stopped for a moment. "My daughter died when she was 7, I continued. "Her name was Emma. She loved these mountains, just like you do. And after she died, I wanted more than anything to have her back, to keep her with me forever." I could feel the ghost children listening, their desperate energy shifting to something like understanding. "But keeping someone because you're lonely isn't love," I said. "Love means letting go when you have to. Love means wanting what's best for them, even if it hurts you." A faint light appeared in the chamber, not from any flashlight, but from the children themselves. They glowed softly in the darkness, like moonlight through fog. "Emma told me the trees talked to her," I said. "Maybe they were telling her about you. Maybe she knew you were here, waiting for someone to remember you." The boy in overalls stepped forward. In the ghostly light, I could see tears on his coal-stained face. "No one remembers our names," he said. "No one knows we were here." "I do," I said. "I've read the memorial plaque. I know about the mining accident, about what happened to you. You were just children. You were working in the mine when you should have been playing outside." The shaking stopped. The chamber became very quiet except for the sound of my own breathing and Tommy's. "I can tell people about you," I said. "I can make sure your story is remembered, but you have to let the living children go home to their families." The girl with pigtails looked at Tommy, then back at me. "If we let him go, will you visit us? Will you tell people we're still here?" "Yes," I promised. But you have to stop taking children. You have to let them live their own lives. The boy in overalls walked over to Tommy and knelt down to his level. You have to go back now, he said gently. Your mama and papa are worried about you. But I like playing here, Tommy said. I know, the boy said, but living children belong in the living world. We belong here, in the mountain. That's just the way things are. Tommy nodded like he understood, even though he was only 8 years old. Maybe being around the dead children had taught him something about the way the world really worked. The ghost children formed a circle around us, and suddenly we were moving through the mine without walking. The tunnels blurred past us like we were flying through rock and darkness. In what felt like seconds, we were back at the mine entrance. Remember us, the girl with pigtails said as we stepped out into the daylight. Please remember us. I will, I promised. The ghost children faded away like morning mist, and Tommy and I were alone in Dead Man's Hollow. My radio crackled to life. Somehow we had signal again. Rebecca, this is Jake. My partner's voice came through the static. Any sign of the missing boy? I looked down at Tommy, who was staring back at the mine entrance with a confused expression, like he was trying to remember something from a dream. I've got him, I radioed back. Tommy's safe. We're heading back to the campsite now. As we walked back through the forest, Tommy kept looking over his shoulder toward the mine. Miss Rebecca, he said, I had the strangest dream while I was lost. I dreamed I was playing with kids who lived in the mountain. They were really sad because no one remembered their names. What names did they tell you? I asked. Tommy thought for a moment. Billy and Sarah and Matthew and lots of names. They wanted me to tell someone about them, but I can't remember all of them. That's okay, I said, taking his hand. I know where to find their names. Tommy's parents cried when they saw us coming out of the woods. Mrs. Chen hugged her son so tight I thought she might squeeze the breath out of him, while Mr. Chen kept saying, thank you, over and over again. Where did you find him? Mrs. Chen asked. Near the old mining area, I said, which was true enough. He got turned around in the fog. It happens a lot up here. Tommy didn't remember much about his time in the mine. He talked about his dream a few more times, but after a couple of days, even that faded. His parents took him home to the city, probably relieved to get away from these strange mountains. But I kept my promise to the ghost children. I spent the next week researching the 1,878 mining accident. I found old newspaper articles, mining company records, even a few family letters. The 12 children who died had names: Billy Morrison, Sarah Webb, Matthew Ford, and 9 others. They'd been working in the mine to help support their families, the way poor children did back then. I wrote up a detailed report about the accident and submitted it to the park's cultural history program. I pushed for a new memorial, something more visible than the hidden plaque that was falling apart in the rhododendron thickets. It took 6 months, but we got approval for a proper memorial garden near the visitor center. 12 small headstones with each child's name, age, and the date they died. A plaque explaining what happened and why these children were working in a dangerous mine instead of going to school. Now, when school groups come to the park, their guides tell them about the mining children. They learn about what life was like for poor kids in the 1800s, how they worked in terrible conditions just to help their families survive. The children's names are remembered now, their story is told, and the ghost children have kept their part of the bargain. There haven't been any more reports of kids seeing pale children in old-fashioned clothes in the woods. No more mysterious disappearances near Dead Man's Hollow. But I still patrol that area regularly. And sometimes, on quiet October mornings when the fog is thick in the hollow, I hear faint voices singing the old mining songs. Not sad anymore, not desperate or lonely. Just children playing in the only home they've ever known. I still clean the old memorial plaque when I find it, even though there's a new memorial now. And sometimes I leave small toys at the mine entrance, a few marbles, a wooden whistle, things kids from the 1800s might have played with. The toys are always gone the next time I check. My partner Jake asked me once why I spend so much time in Dead Man's Hollow. He said it gives him the creeps, that there's something off about the place. I told him someone needs to watch over it, someone needs to remember. What I didn't tell him is that sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I see a small figure with pigtails watching me from behind the trees. She waves sometimes, like she's thanking me for keeping my promise. And once, just once, I thought I saw another little girl with her, a 7-year-old with dark hair and bright eyes, wearing modern clothes instead of an old-fashioned dress. Emma. But when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. Just trees and mist and the sound of wind through the hollow. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was wishful thinking. Or maybe the mountains really do keep some children safe forever, in their own special way. I don't try to find out for sure. Some questions are better left unanswered. But I keep patrolling Dead Man's Hollow, and I keep telling the story of the 12 mining children who died there, because the dead deserve to be remembered, and the living deserve to go home to their families. And because 13 years of keeping children safe has taught me that sometimes the best way to protect them is simply to make sure they're never forgotten. Even after they're gone,